Hello everyone and welcome back to Shadow Man Stories. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now, let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Victor Stormwind, and I've been a park ranger in Denali for 22 years. I've pulled frozen bodies out of crevasses, talked down hypothermic hikers who thought they were dying, and spent more nights alone in the Alaskan wilderness than most people spend in their own beds. I'm telling you this because what happened to me in February of 1976 changed everything I thought I knew about this place. People always ask me about the scariest thing I've ever seen out here. They expect me to talk about grizzly bears or avalanches, or maybe finding someone who didn't make it through a blizzard. But the truth is, the scariest thing isn't what you can see coming. It's what you can't explain, even when it's standing right in front of you. I'm half Inupiat on my mother's side. Growing up, my grandmother used to tell stories about things that lived in the ice, spirits called Tornarsuk that guarded the old places. I never paid much attention. When you spend your life dealing with real emergencies, you don't have time for ghost stories. That changed on February 12th, 1976. I was at the ranger station when the call came in. A research team from the University of Alaska had gone missing near the McKinley River Basin. 4 climatologists studying ice core samples, last radio contact 6 days ago. In winter conditions like that, 6 days might as well be 6 months. The temperature had been sitting at 40 below for 2 weeks straight. We were in the middle of polar night, that time of year when the sun doesn't come up at all. Just endless darkness broken by the green glow of aurora lights dancing across the sky. I loaded my snowmobile with emergency gear, sleeping bags rated for 60 below, emergency food, first aid supplies, and my radio equipment. The plan was simple: follow their last known route, check their research sites, and hope I'd find them holed up somewhere waiting for rescue. The ride out to their camp took 3 hours through terrain that would kill you if you made one wrong turn. Crevasse fields hidden under fresh snow, ice bridges that could collapse without warning, and cold so intense it made your teeth ache even through a face mask. When I found their base camp, everything looked normal at first. 3 tents set up in a triangle, equipment neatly arranged, even their campfire ring cleared of snow. But something felt wrong the moment I shut off my snowmobile engine. The silence hit me like a wall. I've spent years in the wilderness, and there's always some kind of sound. Wind moving through ice, snow settling, the distant crack of a glacier shifting. But this was different. This was the kind of quiet that makes your heartbeat sound like thunder in your ears. I called out, my voice echoing off the surrounding mountains. "Hello, Park Service, anyone here?" Nothing. I walked to the largest tent and unzipped the entrance. Inside, everything was organized perfectly, sleeping bags laid out. Research notes stacked neatly on a camp table, and a Coleman stove with a pot of coffee sitting on top. I touched the side of the pot. It was warm. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. Coffee doesn't stay warm for 6 days in 40 below weather. It doesn't stay warm for 6 minutes. I checked the other tents, finding more of the same. Personal belongings arranged carefully, no signs of struggle or panic. It was like 4 people had simply vanished in the middle of their daily routine. I tried my radio, but all I got was static, mixed with something that sounded almost like whispers. The voices were speaking in Inupiat, but they were too faint to understand. I figured it was just interference from the mountains. Following their equipment trail, I found their drilling site about half a mile from camp. They'd been taking ice core samples from what looked like an ancient glacier. Their drilling equipment was still set up, but the drill bit was frozen solid, in the ice. That's when I noticed the smell. Something like copper mixed with old snow. And the air felt different, thicker somehow, like breathing through wet wool. I was getting ready to head back to camp when I saw the first body. Dr. Sarah Chen was standing upright in the middle of the drilling site, about 20 feet from their equipment. She was facing the glacier, perfectly still, like she was studying something in the distance. I called her name and started walking toward her. She didn't move, didn't even turn her head. When I got close enough to touch her shoulder, I knew she was dead. She was frozen solid, not just frozen, turned into ice. Her skin was white as snow and hard as stone. Her eyes were wide open, staring at the glacier wall, and there was frost covering her eyelashes and lips. But here's the thing that made my blood run cold. She was standing upright. People who freeze to death don't stand up. They curl into a ball trying to stay warm. They find shelter. They don't stand in the open, staring at nothing. I've seen plenty of bodies in my time as a ranger, and they all tell a story. Hypothermia victims look like they went to sleep. Avalanche victims show signs of trauma, but Sarah looked like she'd been flash frozen while wide awake and alert. I circled around her, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Her clothing wasn't even disturbed. Her winter coat was zipped up properly, her hat was still on her head, and her research notebook was still clutched in her right hand. I tried to take the notebook, thinking it might explain what happened, but her fingers were frozen around it so tight I couldn't pry them loose without breaking something. That's when I heard the sound. It was coming from the glacier, a deep groaning noise like the ice was shifting. But it wasn't random, it had a rhythm to it, almost like breathing. And underneath that, something that sounded almost like voices. I pulled out my radio and tried calling for backup, but all I got was more of those whispered voices in Inupiat. This time they were clearer, and I recognized a few words. They were saying something about the old ones and sacred ground. The temperature started dropping. I could feel it through my heavy winter gear, that bone-deep cold that no amount of clothing can keep out. My breath began forming ice crystals that fell like tiny bells when they hit the ground. I needed to find the other 3 researchers, but I also knew I had to get out of there before whatever happened to Sarah happened to me. Following tracks in the snow, I found Dr. Martinez about 100 yards away. He was in the same condition, frozen solid, standing upright, staring at something I couldn't see. His expression was different, though. Where Sarah looked curious, Martinez looked terrified. The cold was getting worse. My radio started making strange crackling sounds, and the static resolved into what sounded like chanting. Old Inupiat words my grandmother had used in her stories, words about spirits and guardians, and things that should stay buried. I found the 3rd body, Dr. Williams, near a small ice formation that I swear hadn't been there when I arrived. He was frozen just like the others, but he was pointing at something carved into the ice wall behind him. The carvings looked ancient, symbols and faces that hurt to look at directly. They seemed to move when I wasn't looking straight at them, shifting and changing like they were alive. That's when I realized what I was looking at. This wasn't just a research site. They'd drilled into something that was supposed to stay buried, something sacred. The 4th researcher, Dr. Patterson, was nowhere to be found. I was getting ready to head back to my snowmobile when the ice under my feet started making sounds. Not cracking sounds, sounds like words. Like the glacier itself was trying to talk. I ran back toward camp, my boots crunching through snow that felt different now. Harder. More like walking on bones than ice. When I got back to my snowmobile, I found Dr. Patterson. He was sitting on the seat, frozen solid like the others, but his eyes were moving. Just his eyes, tracking back and forth like he was watching something. When he saw me, his mouth opened slightly and a puff of frozen air came out, along with words I could barely hear. "It's awake." Then his eyes stopped moving, and he was completely still. I tried to start my snowmobile, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The fuel line was frozen solid, and there were ice crystals growing on the engine block in patterns that looked deliberate, like something had shaped them. I was stranded 80 miles from the nearest help with 4 frozen corpses, and something in the glacier that was definitely not natural. That's when I saw the footprints. The footprints were huge, bigger than any human could make. Each one was perfectly preserved in the hard-packed snow, about 3 feet long and 2 feet wide. But they weren't boot prints. They looked like bare feet, if bare feet could be made of ice. The prints led away from my disabled snowmobile toward the glacier face. I followed them because I had to know what I was dealing with, even though every instinct I had was screaming at me to find another way out of there. The trail led to a section of the glacier I hadn't noticed before. There was a crack in the ice wall, maybe 8 feet high and just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The footprints disappeared right into it. I pulled out my flashlight and shined it into the opening. Instead of solid ice, there was a tunnel stretching back into the glacier. The walls were smooth like glass, and they reflected my light in strange ways that made it look like there were shapes moving deeper inside. I should have turned around right then. Any reasonable person would have. But I could hear something echoing from inside the tunnel. A sound like wind chimes made of ice, mixed with what might have been singing. I squeezed through the opening and started following the tunnel. The ice walls were covered with more of those carved symbols, but these were different, newer. Some of them were still being carved as I watched, invisible hands scraping patterns into the ice right in front of me. The tunnel opened into a huge chamber inside the glacier. The ceiling was maybe 30 feet high, and the whole space was lit by a weird blue glow that seemed to come from the ice itself. Hanging from the ceiling were what looked like icicles, but they were moving gently back and forth like they were alive. In the center of the chamber was something that made my breath catch in my throat. It was a circle of ice statues, maybe 20 of them, all facing inward. But they weren't carved statues. They were people. Men and women in various types of clothing from different time periods. Some wore modern winter gear, others had older outfits that looked like they were from the early 1900s. A few were dressed in traditional Inupiat clothing that could have been hundreds of years old. All of them were frozen, solid, like the researchers, but their faces were turned upward, like they were looking at something above them. And their expressions weren't afraid. They looked peaceful, almost happy. I realized I was looking at a collection that had been growing for a very long time. That's when I noticed the sound of breathing. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere, like the whole glacier was inhaling and exhaling. With each breath, the blue glow got brighter and dimmer, and the ice statues seemed to sway slightly. I backed toward the tunnel entrance, but the opening wasn't there anymore. The wall was smooth ice, like there had never been a way in or out. A voice spoke behind me. Not in English, but I understood it anyway, like the words were being placed directly in my mind. You have disturbed the resting place. I turned around and saw something that shouldn't have been possible. It was shaped like a person, but made entirely of ice. 20 feet tall, with features that looked carved but moved like living flesh. Its eyes were deep blue and seemed to hold the cold of 1,000 winters. When it spoke, frost formed in the air around its mouth. The small ones came with their machines. It said, "They drilled into the sacred ground. They woke us from our sleep." I tried to speak, but my voice came out as barely a whisper. "What are you?" "I am Tornarsuk, guardian of this place, keeper of the old ways." It took a step toward me, and the temperature in the chamber dropped another 10 degrees. "Your people have forgotten how to show respect." I thought about my grandmother's stories, about the spirits that lived in the ice and protected sacred places. "I didn't know," I said. "The researchers didn't know." "Ignorance is not forgiveness," the creature said. "They took what was not theirs to take. They broke what was meant to stay whole." It gestured toward the circle of frozen people. "Now they join the others who have trespassed. They will guard this place as we do, until the ice melts and the world ends." I realized it was talking about adding me to the collection. "Wait," I said, remembering something my grandmother had taught me. My grandmother was Mary Stormwind. She knew the old ways. She taught me the proper words. The creature paused, its icy features shifting slightly. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the words she had used when we visited sacred places. Words of respect and asking permission. I spoke them in Inupiat, my voice shaking from cold and fear. When I opened my eyes, the Tornarsuk was studying me with something that might have been surprise. "You carry the old blood," it said finally. "And you speak the proper words." "I do," I said, "and I swear to you, if you let me leave this place, I'll make sure no one else disturbs it. I'll keep people away." The creature was quiet for a long time, its breath creating clouds of ice crystals in the air between us. "The damage is done," it said. "But perhaps you can help heal it." The Tornarsuk moved closer, and I could feel the cold radiating from its body like standing next to an open freezer. Up close, I could see that its ice wasn't smooth. It was made up of thousands of tiny faces, all of them peaceful, all of them watching me. "The researchers broke through into our resting chamber," it said. "They took samples of ice that has been sacred for 1,000 years. That ice must be returned." I nodded, even though I had no idea how I was going to manage that. "Where is it?" "Their machine still holds it," the Tornarsuk said. "Bring it back to the sacred chamber, and speak the words of restoration your grandmother taught you. And then, you'll let me go." The creature's expression changed, becoming something that might have been sadness. I will let you try to leave. But the cold has already touched you. You may find that the warm world no longer welcomes you. Before I could ask what that meant, the wall behind me cracked open, revealing the tunnel back to the surface. But now the tunnel was filled with that blue glow, and I could see things moving in the ice walls, shapes that looked like they were swimming through solid ice. I ran through the tunnel as fast as I could, feeling the cold chasing me like something alive. When I burst out of the glacier, the world outside looked different. The aurora lights were brighter, making everything glow green and blue. And I could see shapes moving in the distance, tall figures walking across the snow, too far away to make out clearly. I made it back to the drilling site, where the frozen researchers were still standing in their impossible poses. The drilling equipment was right where they'd left it, and I could see ice core samples in a refrigerated container next to the drill. The samples were glowing with the same blue light I'd seen in the chamber. I gathered up all the ice samples and carried them back to the glacier crack. The tunnel was still there, still glowing. I made the trip back to the sacred chamber, my arms full of stolen ice. The Tornarsuk was waiting for me, along with something new, a hole in the floor of the chamber, perfectly round and so deep I couldn't see the bottom. Place the sacred ice in the well, it commanded. I dumped the samples into the hole and watched them fall until they disappeared. Almost immediately, the blue glow in the chamber got brighter, and I heard a sound like wind chimes made of crystal. "Now speak the words," the Tornarsuk said. I tried to remember exactly what my grandmother had taught me. Words about healing and restoration, about putting things back the way they were meant to be. I spoke them in Inupiat, and as I did, I felt something change in the chamber. The ice statues in the circle began to move. Not breaking free, but shifting position, turning to face the well where I'd returned the stolen ice. And their expressions changed from peaceful to something like satisfaction. "It is done," the Tornarsuk said. "The sacred ice is returned, the balance is restored." "What about the researchers?" I asked. "They chose their fate when they broke sacred ground," the creature said. "They will remain as guardians, as have all those who came before them." "And me?" The Tornarsuk studied me for a long moment. "You have shown respect. You have made restoration. You may leave this place." I felt a wave of relief, but it didn't last long. "But you carry our cold now," the creature continued. "You have breathed the air of the sacred chamber. You will never be fully warm again, and you will know when the sacred places are threatened." Before I could ask what that meant, the tunnel entrance appeared again. This time, I could see daylight at the far end. I ran through that tunnel faster than I'd ever run in my life, the Tornarsuk's voice following me. "Remember your promise, Victor Stormwind. Keep the sacred places safe." When I burst out of the glacier, my snowmobile was running, the engine was warm, the fuel lines were clear, and all my equipment was working perfectly. I didn't look back as I rode away from that place. I made it back to the ranger station, just as a search and rescue team was getting ready to come look for me. I'd been missing for 18 hours, though it felt like days. I told them I'd found the research team dead, victims of equipment failure and extreme cold exposure. The official report listed it as a tragic accident, 4 scientists who got caught in a sudden temperature drop and couldn't make it back to their shelter. No one questioned why they were found standing upright. No one asked about the strange carvings in the glacier. The recovery team brought out the bodies and sealed off the research site, listing it as too dangerous for civilian access. I never told anyone the real story. Who would believe it? But the Tornarsuk was right about carrying the cold. Even now, 40 years later, I can't get truly warm. I wear heavy coats in summer and sleep under electric blankets year-round. People think it's just old age, but I know better. And I can feel when the sacred places are threatened. Over the years, I've made sure no one else drills in that area. I've redirected hiking trails, convinced other researchers to study different locations, and filed enough environmental protection reports to keep that glacier off limits permanently. But lately, I've been feeling that cold getting stronger. There are new developers looking at the region, new research teams wanting to study climate change in the area. They don't know what they're dealing with. Sometimes, on clear winter nights, I can see shapes moving across the distant glaciers, tall figures walking slowly through the snow, watching and waiting. The Tornarsuk are still out there, guarding their sacred places. And as long as people keep pushing into areas they shouldn't go, as long as they keep taking things that weren't meant to be taken, those guardians will keep adding to their collection. I've seen what happens when you disturb the old places. I've felt the touch of that ancient cold. And I know that somewhere in that glacier, Dr. Sarah Chen is still standing guard, still watching over sacred ground she helped violate, along with all the others who came before her, and all who will come after. The ice remembers everything, and it never forgives. That's why I'm telling you this story, because climate change is melting the glaciers, exposing places that were meant to stay buried. And there are more sacred sites out there than you'd think. If you ever find yourself in the far north, and you come across ice formations that don't look quite natural, or you hear voices whispering in languages you don't recognize, or you feel that bone-deep cold that no clothing can keep out, turn around and walk away. Some places aren't meant for the living, and the Tornarsuk are always watching. My name is Samuel Ironbear, and I've been a park ranger at Katmai for 19 years. In all that time, I thought I'd seen everything these volcanic lands could throw at me. I was wrong. September 1979 started like any other fall season. The salmon runs were winding down, and the brown bears were getting ready for their long winter sleep. Most tourists had gone home by then, leaving just the serious photographers and researchers who knew this was the best time to see the big bears without crowds. I grew up in these parts. My grandmother used to tell stories about Amarok, giant wolves that hunted in the old days. She'd talk about Nanook too, bears that could change into men and back again. I always figured they were just stories to keep kids from wandering too far into the wilderness. The Valley of 10,000 Smokes is different from other places in Alaska. Volcanic ash covers everything like gray snow that never melts. Steam rises from cracks in the ground where the earth is still hot from the eruption 60 years ago. Radio signals bounce around the volcanic rock walls, so you can't always reach the outside world. When you're out there, you're really on your own. I was checking campsites that morning when I saw the plane. A small float plane circled twice before landing on Naknek Lake. 3 people got out, 2 men and a woman, all carrying expensive camera gear. The pilot helped them unload their equipment, then took off again. He was supposed to pick them up in 4 days. The group leader introduced himself as Dr. Marcus Webb from some wildlife magazine. He had gray hair and confident eyes, the kind of man who was used to being in charge. The woman was his assistant, Sarah Chen, young and excited about her first Alaska assignment. The third person was Jake Morrison, a local guide from Anchorage who'd worked with them before. "We're here for the big browns, Doctor," Webb told me. "Want to get some shots of them fishing before winter sets in." I gave them the usual safety talk. Keep food locked up. Make noise when you walk. Never get between a mother and her cubs. Don't approach bears closer than 100 yards. They nodded and said they understood, but I could tell they were thinking about their cameras more than my warnings. "There's been some unusual bear activity this season," I added. "Tracks we can't quite explain. Maybe you should stick to the main viewing areas." Dr. Webb smiled. "We didn't come all this way to take pictures from a viewing platform, Ranger. We know how to handle ourselves around bears." I watched them hike toward the backcountry with their heavy packs. Something felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The air was too still. Even the ground squirrels were quiet. In 19 years, I'd learned to trust those feelings. That night, I dreamed about my grandmother's stories. In the dream, something huge was moving through the volcanic ash, leaving tracks that looked almost human but too big and with claws. I woke up sweating, even though my cabin was cold. The next morning, I decided to check on the photography team. It was part of my job, I told myself. Nothing more than routine patrol. I found their camp in a clearing near Knife Creek. Their tents were set up properly, food hung correctly in bear caches. But something was off. No smoke from a morning campfire, no sounds of people getting ready for the day. It was too quiet. "Hello," I called out. "Ranger Ironbear checking in." No answer. I walked closer to the tents. The zippers were all closed tight. Maybe they were still sleeping, but it was almost noon, and serious photographers are usually up with the sun. I was about to call out again when I saw the tracks. They were in the ash near the creek, paw prints bigger than any brown bear I'd ever seen. Each print was 15 inches long and showed claws that extended almost 4 inches beyond the pads. But what made my blood turn cold was the spacing between them. The tracks showed the bear had been walking upright. No brown bear walks on its hind legs for more than a few steps. These tracks went on for 50 yards, showing a steady bipedal gait like a person walking. But no person had feet like these. I followed the trail with my eyes and saw where it led, right to the photographer's camp. I pulled out my radio and tried to reach headquarters. Static crackled back at me. The volcanic rock was blocking signals again. I was on my own until I could get to higher ground. "Dr. Webb?" I called out, louder this time. "Sarah? Jake? Is everyone okay?" Still nothing. I approached the first tent carefully. Through the thin nylon, I could see the shape of a sleeping bag with someone inside. But they weren't moving, not even breathing that I could see. "I'm coming in," I announced, and slowly unzipped the tent flap. The smell hit me first, copper and something wild, like a wet animal. Dr. Webb was in his sleeping bag, but his eyes were wide open, staring at nothing. 3 long gashes ran across his chest, straight through his heavy jacket. The cuts were too deep and too precise for any normal animal attack. My hands shook as I checked for a pulse I knew I wouldn't find. His body was cold. This had happened hours ago. I backed out of the tent and moved to the next one. Sarah Chen was inside, curled up in a ball. The same 3 gashes marked her back. But what made me stumble backward was her face, frozen in an expression of complete terror, like she'd seen something impossible before she died. The third tent was empty, except for Jake's gear. His sleeping bag was shredded, and there was blood on the tent walls, but no body. I stood in the middle of their camp, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. 20 years in these woods, and I'd never seen anything like this. Brown bears don't hunt humans, they avoid us. And they definitely don't kill with the kind of precision I was looking at. That's when I heard the sound. It came from the trees across the creek, a low rumbling that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite human speech. It seemed to be coming from something with a very large chest cavity, something that could make sounds no bear should be able to make. I grabbed my rifle from its case and chambered around. The sound stopped. The forest went completely silent. No birds, no squirrels. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I scanned the tree line, looking for movement. Brown bears are huge, but they can move through thick brush without making a sound when they want to. All I could see were the dark spaces between the spruce trees where anything could be hiding. Then I saw it, just for a second, between 2 trees, about 100 yards away. Something massive and dark, standing upright like a person. But it was too tall and too broad to be human. And when it moved, it didn't walk, it flowed, like liquid shadow, pouring between the trees. I raised my rifle, but by the time I had the scope to my eye, there was nothing there. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I'd seen plenty of bears over the years, including some really big males. But bears don't stand 12 feet tall. And they don't watch you with what looked like human intelligence. I needed to get these bodies out and report what happened. But first, I had to find Jake Morrison. Maybe he'd gotten away. Maybe he was hiding somewhere, wounded but alive. I followed the blood trail from his tent. It led toward the creek, then disappeared where the ground turned rocky. But on the far side of the water, I found something that made my stomach turn. Jake's camera was hanging from a tree branch about 10 feet off the ground. Not dropped or thrown, hung carefully, like someone had placed it there on purpose. The camera was still running, its red recording light blinking steadily. I had to wade across the creek and climb the tree to get it down. When I rewound the tape and looked through the viewfinder, I saw what Jake had filmed in his final moments. The footage was shaky and hard to follow at first. Jake was running, the camera bouncing with each step. Behind him, something was crashing through the brush. Then he tripped and the camera flew out of his hands, landing so it pointed back toward where he'd come from. For just a few seconds, the image was perfectly clear. A bear came out of the trees, but not like any bear I'd ever seen. This one was walking upright on its hind legs, moving with the balance and coordination of a person. Its front paws hung at its sides like arms. Its head turned left and right as it searched for something. Then it looked directly at the camera. The thing's eyes reflected the light like mirrors, but there was something behind that reflection. Something that looked almost human. The bear tilted its head, studying the camera with obvious curiosity. That's when Jake appeared at the edge of the frame, trying to crawl away. The creature turned toward him with movements that were too smooth, too controlled for any normal animal. The tape went to static after that. I climbed down from the tree with shaking hands. Whatever had killed Dr. Webb and Sarah Chen had taken Jake alive. And it was smart enough to know what a camera was, smart enough to hang it where someone would find it, smart enough to leave a message. I started back toward my truck, moving as quietly as I could. Every shadow looked like it might be hiding something huge and impossible. Every sound made me spin around with my rifle ready, but I made it to the vehicle without seeing anything else. As I drove toward headquarters, I kept checking my rearview mirror. The road behind me stayed empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me just out of sight. I had to report what I'd found, but who would believe me? A bear that walks like a man and hangs cameras in trees? They'd think the isolation had finally gotten to me, but I had Jake's tape. Whatever was on that recording, it was real. And somewhere in the volcanic wilderness behind me, it was still out there. By the time I reached headquarters, the sun was setting behind the volcanic peaks. Chief Ranger Tom Phillips took one look at my face and poured himself a strong cup of coffee. "What happened out there, Sam?" I told him everything, but I could see in his eyes that he was having trouble believing it. When I showed him Jake's camera footage, he watched the tape 3 times without saying a word. "Could be a guy in a suit," he finally said. "Some kind of hoax. Tom, I've been tracking animals for 30 years. That thing moved like no person ever could. And look at the size of it compared to the trees." He rubbed his forehead. "Okay, let's say you're right. What are we dealing with here?" Before I could answer, the Baxter radio crackled to life. "Katmai Base, this is Alaska 447. We have a problem." Phillips grabbed the handset. "Alaska 447, this is Katmai Base. Go ahead, we're the pickup flight for that photography team. Found their camp about an hour ago. Jesus Christ, what happened down there? Are you at the Knife Creek location?" "Negative. We're at Lake Coville, about 5 miles north. There's pieces of a campsite scattered all over the place. Tents ripped to shreds. Gear thrown around like a tornado hit it. I felt the blood drain from my face." "Tom, that's not where I left them." "Alaska 447. How many people are you seeing?" "That's just it. We're not seeing anybody, but there's blood everywhere, and tracks. Big tracks." Phillips looked at me. "Can you describe the tracks?" "They're huge, man. Bigger than any bear I've ever seen. And they're weird. Some of them look like the bear was walking on its hind legs." "Alaska 447. Do not land. I repeat, do not land. Return to Anchorage and file a report with Fish and Wildlife." "Copy that. We're getting out of here. But you guys need to know, whatever did this is still down there. We saw something big moving in the trees while we were circling." After the pilot signed off, Tom and I sat in silence for a long minute. 5 miles north, he finally said. "Whatever killed those people moved their camp 5 miles in one day." "Or moved the bodies," I said. Tom's face went pale. "Why would it do that?" I thought about my grandmother's stories again. In the old legends, Nanook doesn't just kill for food, it plays with its prey first. It's intelligent. It likes to cause fear. "Sam, you're talking about something that doesn't exist." "Look at the evidence, Tom. 15-inch paw prints, bipedal locomotion, tool use. Hanging that camera was tool use. And now it's moving kill sites around like it's playing some kind of game." The radio crackled again, but this time it was just static with something else underneath, a low rumbling sound that made us both freeze. "Is that—" Tom started. I held up my hand for silence. The rumbling came again, but now it sounded almost like words. Like something was trying to talk through the radio, but its mouth wasn't shaped right for human speech. Then the transmission cut off. "We need to evacuate the park," I said. "Get everyone out until we figure out what we're dealing with. I can't evacuate a whole national park based on weird radio static and some bear tracks." "Then let me go back out there. Let me track this thing and get more evidence." Tom shook his head. "Absolutely not. I'm not sending you after something that can kill 3 people and move a campsite 5 miles. But I was already making plans. Whatever was out there had taken Jake alive for a reason. Maybe he was still breathing, maybe I could still help him, and maybe I could get the proof everyone would need to believe me. That night, I loaded my truck with everything I thought I'd need: extra ammunition for my rifle, emergency flares, a better radio that might cut through the volcanic interference, food for 3 days. I also packed something else, a medicine pouch my grandmother had given me when I first became a ranger. She'd said it would protect me from Nanook if I ever encountered one. I'd always thought it was just a nice gesture from an old woman who loved her grandson. Now I was hoping she'd been right. I left headquarters before dawn, driving the back roads toward Lake Coville. If the thing was moving around, maybe I could track it to wherever it was keeping Jake. The volcanic landscape looked different in the early morning light. The ash fields stretched out like a gray desert, broken by steaming cracks where the earth was still warm underneath. Mount Katmai loomed in the distance, its peak hidden in clouds. I parked where the road ended and continued on, foot. The tracks were easy to follow in the soft volcanic ash. The massive paw prints of something that walked sometimes on 4 legs, sometimes on 2. After about a mile, I found what was left of the photographer's second campsite. The pilot had been right. Gear was scattered everywhere like a bomb had gone off. But what caught my attention were the other tracks around the site. Human footprints, bare feet, small enough to be Jake's. He was alive, at least when they moved the camp. But why was he walking around without shoes? And why did his trail lead deeper into the most dangerous part of the volcanic region? I followed the mixed tracks toward the Valley of 10,000 Smokes. This was where the big eruption had happened in 1912, leaving behind a landscape that still looked like another planet. Steam rose from hundreds of cracks in the ground. The air smelled like sulfur and hot rock. About noon, I found Jake. He was sitting on a boulder next to a steaming fumarole, staring at nothing. He was alive, but something was very wrong with him. His clothes were torn and his feet were cut and bleeding, but he didn't seem to notice. "Jake!" I called out. "Jake, it's Sam Ironbear. Can you hear me?" He turned toward my voice, but his eyes didn't focus on me. He looked right through me like I wasn't there. "Jake, we need to get out of here. Can you walk?" He stood up slowly and started walking, but not toward me. He was heading deeper into the fumarole field, into the most dangerous part of the valley. That's when I realized he wasn't walking on his own. Something was controlling him. I looked around, scanning the rocky landscape for whatever was pulling Jake's strings. The creature could be anywhere, behind any of the steaming vents or rocky outcrops that dotted the valley floor. Then I saw movement near a large fumarole about 50 yards away. Something dark and massive was crouched behind the steam, watching us. It was waiting for me to follow Jake into the fumarole field, waiting to spring its trap. I raised my rifle and put the scope on the fumarole where I'd seen movement. Through the swirling steam, I caught glimpses of something huge shifting position. It knew I'd spotted it. "I know you're there," I shouted. "Let Jake go." The response came as a low rumble that seemed to come from the ground itself. But underneath that animal sound, I could hear something else, syllables that almost sounded like words. Jake kept walking toward the fumarole field, his bare feet leaving bloody prints on the hot volcanic rock. He was going to step right into one of those steam vents if I didn't stop him. I had a choice to make. I could retreat and try to get help, but Jake would be dead before anyone else arrived. Or I could follow him into that hellish landscape and face whatever was controlling him. I thought about my grandmother's stories one more time. In those legends, Nanook was clever and patient. It would set traps and wait for hunters to walk into them. But the stories also said it had weaknesses. It could be confused by strong smells. It couldn't see well through heavy smoke. Looking at all the steam rising from the fumaroles, I had an idea. I pulled out 2 emergency flares and lit them both. The bright red smoke billowed around me as I moved toward Jake. If the creature was tracking me by scent, maybe the flare smoke would mask my smell long enough to reach him. The plan seemed to work. Jake stopped walking when I got close, like whatever was controlling him had lost the signal. His eyes were still blank, but at least he wasn't moving toward the deadly steam vents anymore. "Jake, it's Sam. Can you hear me at all?" For just a moment, his eyes focused on my face. "Sam?" he whispered. "I can't. It won't let me." Then his face went blank again, and he started walking toward the fumaroles. Behind us, something roared. I spun around and saw it clearly for the first time. The creature was standing upright on a rocky ledge about 30 yards away, and it was bigger than anything had a right to be. 12 feet tall when it stood on its hind legs, with shoulders as broad as a truck. Its fur was dark brown, almost black, and its eyes reflected the light like mirrors. But what made my blood freeze was how human-like its movements were. It climbed down from the ledge with the coordination of a person, using its front paws like hands to grip the rocks. When it reached the ground, it stood upright and began walking toward us with smooth, controlled steps. This wasn't just a large bear. This was something that had learned to mimic human behavior. I fired a shot over its head, hoping to scare it away. The creature didn't even flinch. Instead, it tilted its head and made that rumbling sound again. This time, I was sure I heard words hidden in the growl. "Run while you can." It could talk. I grabbed Jake's arm and tried to drag him away from the fumaroles, but he fought me with surprising strength. Whatever control the creature had over him was complete. The thing was getting closer, moving with that impossible fluid grace. I could see details now that I wished I couldn't. The intelligence in its eyes, the way its lips moved when it made sounds, the almost human shape of its front paws. That's when I remembered something else from my grandmother's stories. Nanook could control people's minds, but only if they were afraid. The more scared you got, the stronger its hold became. I forced myself to stay calm and think clearly. The creature wanted me to follow Jake into the fumarole field, where the uneven ground and deadly steam vents would give it every advantage. But what if I could turn those same hazards against it? I lit 2 more flares and threw them toward the largest fumarole nearby. The heavy smoke mixed with the natural steam, creating a thick cloud that covered half the field. Then I did something that went against every survival instinct I had. I walked straight toward the creature. It stopped moving, confused by my unexpected behavior. Its grip on Jake seemed to weaken. He stumbled and nearly fell, like he was waking up from a dream. "That's right," I called out to the thing. "I'm not running. I'm not afraid of you." That was a lie. I was terrified. But my grandmother had taught me that sometimes you have to lie to monsters. The creature's rumbling growl grew louder, more frustrated. It started toward me, but now it was moving on all 4s like a regular bear. The human-like coordination was gone. I kept walking toward it until we were only 20 feet apart. This close, I could smell its breath, like rotten fish and sulfur. Its eyes were locked on mine, trying to establish the same kind of control it had over Jake. But I focused on my breathing and thought about my grandmother's medicine pouch. Whether it had real power or not, believing in it kept me calm. "You're just an animal," I said. "A smart animal, but still just an animal." The creature roared and charged. I dove to the side and rolled behind a rocky outcrop just as 800 pounds of muscle and claws slammed into the spot where I'd been standing. The thing was fast, but the rocky terrain worked in my favor. It couldn't turn as quickly as I could. I came up running toward the thickest part of the smoke cloud. The creature followed, crashing through the steam with all the grace of a freight train. But in the thick smoke and shifting steam, it couldn't see me clearly. I could hear it blundering around, getting more frustrated by the second. Its roars echoed off the rocky walls of the valley. But it was making too much noise to track me by sound, and the sulfur from the fumaroles was masking my scent. Finally, I heard what I was waiting for, a splash and a scream of pain. The creature had stepped into one of the pretended thermal pools. The water in those pools was hot enough to cook an egg. Even something as tough as this bear thing couldn't ignore that kind of pain. I circled around through the smoke until I could see it thrashing in the steaming water, trying to get out. The pool wasn't deep enough to drown it, but the heat was doing serious damage. While it was distracted, I ran to where I'd left Jake. He was sitting on the ground, holding his head like he had a terrible headache. "Jake, we have to go, now." He looked up at me with clear eyes for the first time. "Sam, what? Where are we?" "I'll explain later." "Can you run?" He nodded and got to his feet. We started back toward my truck, moving as fast as we could over the uneven volcanic terrain. Behind us, the creature's roars gradually faded, but I knew it wasn't dead. Hurt, maybe, Angry, definitely, but not dead, and I had a feeling it would remember who had caused its pain. We made it back to my truck without being pain. Followed, but Jake collapsed as soon as he sat down in the passenger seat. His feet were torn up from walking barefoot over volcanic rock, and he was shaking like he had a fever. It was in my head, he kept saying. I could hear it thinking. It was so angry, Sam, angry at everything. I radioed headquarters while I drove, but I kept the details simple. Found Jake Morrison alive, bringing him to the medical station. Send backup to secure the Coville area. Copy that, Sam. What happened to the others? Still missing, I said. There would be time for full explanations later. Jake spent 2 days in the hospital in Anchorage. The doctors said he was suffering from severe dehydration and exposure, but they couldn't explain his psychological condition. He kept talking about voices in his head and dreams that felt more real than being awake. The official report listed Dr. Webb and Sarah Chen as victims of a bear attack. Their bodies were found exactly where I'd first discovered them at Knife Creek. The creature had moved them back, like it was cleaning up after itself. No mention was made of 15-inch paw prints or bipedal locomotion. The investigators found evidence of a large brown bear in the area, and that was enough for them. Case closed. But Chief Ranger Phillips and I knew better. We instituted new safety protocols for the Valley of 10,000 Smokes. No single-person patrols during salmon season, mandatory check-ins every 4 hours. And we quietly advised tour operators to avoid the Coville area during September and October. I never saw the creature again, but I knew it was still out there. Sometimes, on clear nights, I could hear sounds echoing from the volcanic peaks, roars that lasted too long and had too much intelligence behind them. Jake left Alaska a week after getting out of the hospital. He couldn't handle being in the wilderness anymore. Too many shadows looked like they might be moving. Too many sounds made him think something was calling his name. Before he flew back to the lower 48, he gave me his camera. I don't want it, he said. Every time I look through that viewfinder, I see those eyes staring back at me. I kept the camera, and sometimes I watched the footage he'd recorded. The image was grainy and shaky, but you could see the intelligence in the creature's eyes when it looked at the lens. It knew it was being recorded. It understood what that meant. That was the most frightening part of all. 6 months later, I got a call from a researcher at the University of Alaska. She was studying Yupik folklore and had heard rumors about unusual bear activity in Katmai. She wanted to know if I'd seen anything strange. There's something you should understand about the old stories, she told me. Nanook wasn't just a shapeshifter. According to legend, it was the spirit of a shaman who went too far. Someone who learned to change into bear form but lost his way back to Belust, being human. The stories say it's still out there, stuck between two worlds. Not quite human, not quite bear. And it hates both forms of existence. I thanked her for the information, but I didn't tell her what I'd seen. Some knowledge is too dangerous to share. These days, I still patrol the volcanic regions of Katmai, but I'm more careful than I used to be. I carry extra flares and a better radio. I make sure someone always knows where I'm going and when I should be back. And I wear my grandmother's medicine pouch every time I go into the field. The creature might still be out there, somewhere in the deep caves, where the volcanic heat keeps the ground warm all winter, waiting for the salmon runs to bring new people into its territory, waiting for another chance to show the world that some legends are based on terrible truth. Sometimes I wonder if I should have tried harder to kill it that day in the fumaroles. But something tells me it would have taken more than bullets to put that thing down permanently. For now, it's enough that people know to be careful in the Valley of 10,000 Smokes during bear season. It's enough that the tour guides tell their clients to stay together and make noise when they walk. It's enough that the stories my grandmother told me are being passed down to a new generation of rangers who might someday face what I faced. Because in a place like Katmai, where the earth itself is still alive and changing, there's always room for things that shouldn't exist. Things that remember the old ways. Things that are still hungry. My name is Margaret Frostborn, and I've been a ranger at Glacier Bay National Park for 12 years now. People always comment on my last name when they hear what I do for work, like it was destiny or something. Maybe it was. I've spent more time on glacial ice than most people spend in their own backyards. March 1988 was when everything changed. The spring breakup was starting early that year, which meant the ice was getting unstable. Huge chunks of glacier would crash into the ocean without warning, sending waves that could flip a boat if you weren't careful. Most tourists stayed away during this time, but there were always a few who thought they knew better. I was checking the marine wildlife stations near Muir Glacier when the call came in on my radio. Static made it hard to understand at first, but I caught the important parts. Missing kayakers, 3 boats found floating empty near the glacier face. No sign of the people who'd been paddling them. How long have they been missing? I asked dispatch. Best guess is since yesterday morning. Coast Guard's sending a helicopter, but weather's closing in fast. I looked up at the gray clouds building over the glacier. The wind was picking up too, that cold, sharp wind that comes down from the ice fields. We called it katabatic wind, but the old Tlingit people had their own names for it. They said it carried voices of things that shouldn't be walking around. I'd never paid much attention to the old stories before. I was a marine biologist before I became a ranger, spent 4 years in college learning about real things: fish populations, water temperature, ice formation. The Tlingit elders who sometimes visited the park would tell stories about Kushtaka, shape-shifting otter people who lived in the ice and water. I always nodded politely and filed it under local folklore. Maybe I should have listened closer. The missing kayakers were from Anchorage, a family reunion trip. Parents, 2 adult kids, and a teenage nephew. They'd registered for a 3-day camping permit and knew enough about glacier safety to worry me. These weren't tourists who'd wandered into dangerous water by mistake. Tom Kovach, the father, had been kayaking in Alaska for 20 years. I loaded my gear into the patrol boat and headed toward the glacier face. The water was full of small icebergs, growlers. We called them because of the sound they made, rubbing against each other. I had to weave carefully between them, listening to my engine echo off the ice walls that rose 300 feet above me. The first kayak was floating about half a mile from the glacier, bumping gently against a small iceberg. Bright yellow fiberglass, impossible to miss. I pulled up alongside and grabbed the bowline. The paddle was still clipped to the deck, and there was a half-eaten granola bar in the cockpit. No signs of struggle, no holes in the boat, no blood. It was like the person paddling, it had just vanished. I found the other 2 kayaks within 100 yards, drifting in the same general area. Same story, everything normal except for the missing people. Their camping gear was still strapped to the decks, including expensive sleeping bags and a GPS unit. Nobody abandons that kind of equipment unless something terrible has happened. I called it in and started searching the shoreline. The glacier face was too dangerous to approach directly. Chunks of ice the size of cars could break off and crush a small boat. But there were some gravel beaches where someone might wash up. I spent 2 hours checking every inlet and cove I could reach safely. Nothing. The helicopter arrived just as the weather started getting bad. I watched it circle the area for 30 minutes before the pilot's voice crackled over my radio. Ranger Frostborn, visibility's dropping fast. We'll have to call it off and try again tomorrow. By the time I got back to the ranger station, snow was falling hard enough to cover my tracks within minutes. I filled out the incident report and tried not to think about 5 people somewhere out there in the cold. Maybe they'd made it to shore. Maybe they were huddled in one of the emergency shelters scattered around the park. But I kept thinking about those kayaks. They'd been floating in deep water, at least a mile from any shoreline someone could swim to. The water temperature was 38 degrees, cold enough to kill someone in 15 minutes, even with a wetsuit. And all 3 boats had been found in roughly the same spot, like they'd been placed there deliberately. I made myself dinner and tried to focus on the weather report. The storm would last at least 2 days, which meant no helicopter search until Thursday. Ground teams couldn't reach that part of the glacier safely, especially with the spring breakup making the ice unstable. That night I dreamed about voices calling from inside the Gadabout glacier. When I woke up, I couldn't remember what they were saying, but the sound of them stayed with me all morning. The storm cleared Wednesday afternoon, but I couldn't wait for the official search to resume. I know these waters better than any Coast Guard pilot, and time was running out. If those people were hurt and stranded somewhere, another night in the open could kill them. I took the patrol boat out alone, which wasn't exactly following protocol, but I'd done worse things in my 12 years of service. The water was calmer after the storm, but there were more icebergs than usual. The glacier had been calving heavily during the bad weather. I decided to check some of the ice caves along the glacier face. They form when meltwater carves tunnels through the ice, creating chambers big enough to shelter in. Most of them are too dangerous to enter, but desperate people might try anything. The first few caves I checked were empty, except for ice and shadows. I called out, anyway, hoping to hear a voice answer back. The echo of my shouts seemed to last longer than it should have, like the sound was traveling deeper into the ice than I could see. It was in the fourth cave that I found the first strange thing. I'd pulled my boat up to a ledge of ice at the cave entrance and was shining my flashlight into the tunnel. The cave went back about 30 feet before curving out of sight. Nothing unusual about that, but there were marks on the ice walls that didn't look natural. Scratches, maybe 8 inches long, running parallel in groups of 4. They were too regular to be from ice movement, too deep to be from an animal. I'd never seen anything like them. I called out again, "Hello, anyone in there? This is Park Ranger Frostborn." The echo came back wrong. Instead of my voice fading away into silence, I heard something else mixed in with it. A sound like clicking, or maybe teeth chattering. It lasted just a second, but it made the hair on my neck stand up. I climbed onto the ice ledge and walked a few feet into the cave. The scratches were everywhere once I started looking for them. On the walls, the ceiling, even the floor. Some looked fresh, like they'd been made recently. Others were older, filled with new ice that made them hard to see. "Hello?" I called again, quieter this time. The clicking sound came back clearer. Definitely not an echo. It was coming from deeper in the cave, past the curve where my flashlight couldn't reach. I should have left right then. Every part of my training said to get back in the boat and call for backup. But those 5 missing people were out there somewhere, and this was the first sign I'd found that something had happened in these caves. I walked deeper into the tunnel. The ice walls pressed close on both sides, forcing me to move in single file. My flashlight beam showed smooth ice ahead, curved like the inside of a pipe. The scratches continued along the walls, sometimes in neat parallel lines, sometimes in random clusters like claw marks. The clicking sound stopped. I froze and listened. Nothing but the drip of meltwater and the distant rumble of waves against ice. Then I heard something else, a soft splashing sound, like something moving through water. I aimed my flashlight ahead and saw that the cave floor dropped away into a pool of dark water. The tunnel continued on the other side, but there was no way to cross without swimming. The water looked deep and black, fed by meltwater from somewhere higher up in the glacier. That's when I saw the bones. They were scattered around the edge of the water, white and clean, like they'd been there for years. I moved closer and realized they weren't animal bones. The skull I was looking at had definitely belonged to a person. I was backing away when something grabbed my ankle. The grip was iron strong and cold as the ice around me. I looked down and saw a pale hand. Reaching up from the water, fingers wrapped around my boot. The arm it was attached to disappeared into the dark pool. I screamed and tried to pull free, but the grip tightened. My flashlight beam swept wildly across the cave as I struggled, and I caught a glimpse of something rising from the water. Pale as glacier ice, with dark holes where its eyes should be, and teeth that were too sharp and too many. It made that clicking sound again, right in front of my face. I yanked my foot backward as hard as I could. My boot came loose, and I fell hard against the ice wall, but I was free. The thing in the water made a sound like hissing and sank back below the surface. I ran. The cave tunnel seemed to stretch forever as I stumbled back toward the entrance. My one remaining boot slipped on the wet ice, and I went down twice, scraping my hands and knees. Behind me I could hear splashing, and that horrible clicking sound, getting closer. I burst out of the cave and dove into my patrol boat, fumbling with the engine controls. The motor caught on the third try, and I gunned it away from the ice ledge, not looking back until I was 100 yards out. When I finally turned around, the cave entrance looked normal. Empty. Like nothing had happened. But my boot was gone, and there were scratches on my ankle that went right through my thick wool sock. I didn't report what happened in the cave. Who would have believed me? Instead, I radioed that I'd found evidence of human activity in the ice caves and requested backup for a more thorough search. The Coast Guard sent a team the next morning. Lieutenant Davis was a good man, thorough, experienced, and smart enough to listen when locals told him about dangerous conditions. I led his team to the cave where I'd lost my boot, but I didn't mention the pale thing in the water. You said you found bones, Ranger Frostborn? Davis asked as we approached the cave entrance. That's right. Human remains, looked old. We secured our boats to the ice ledge and entered the cave with proper equipment this time. Military-grade flashlights, rope, and a portable radio. Davis had brought a photographer to document anything we found. The scratches on the walls were still there, but the bones by the water's edge were gone. You're sure this is the right cave? Davis asked, shining his light around the empty space. Positive. There were at least a dozen bone fragments right here by the water. We searched every inch of the cave. The pool of dark water was still there, and the tunnel continued on the other side, but there was no sign of human remains. No sign of the thing I'd seen rising from the water either. Could have been animal bones, Davis suggested. Sometimes caribou or mountain goats fall into these caves. Hard to tell the difference when they're old and weathered. I nodded and didn't argue. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew those had been human skulls. We spent the rest of the day checking other caves along the glacier face. Davis's team was professional and thorough, but they didn't find anything unusual. Just ice, water, and empty tunnels. That evening, back at the ranger station, I called my friend Susan Crowfeather. She was Tlingit, worked as a cultural liaison for the park, and knew the old stories better than anyone. Susan, what can you tell me about the Kushtaka legends, specifically the ones about things living in glacial ice? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Why are you asking, Margaret? Just curious. Part of a report I'm writing. Another pause. The stories say they're not really animals and not really people. Something in between. They hunt in the boundary places, where ice meets water, where day meets night. They can hold their breath longer than seals and see in the dark, like fish. How do they hunt? They work together. Like wolves. Drive their prey into places where there's no escape. The stories say they can make sounds that confuse people, make them think they're hearing their own voices or someone calling for help. I thought about the clicking sounds I'd heard echoing in the cave. What do they look like? That depends on the story. Sometimes like pale people with too many teeth, sometimes like otters that walk on two legs. But they're always cold to the touch, and they always smell like deep ice. After I hung up, I sat in my cabin and tried to make sense of what had happened. 5 kayakers missing, strange scratches in an ice cave, and something pale grabbing my ankle from dark water. Either I was losing my mind, or there was something in these glaciers that didn't belong in any biology textbook. I decided to do more research. The park library had boxes of old reports and incident files dating back to the 1,920 seconds. I spent most of the next day reading through them, looking for patterns. What I found made my hands shake. Missing persons cases near the glacier face, going back 60 years. Usually small groups, kayakers, climbers, researchers. The pattern was always the same. Abandoned equipment found intact, no bodies recovered, searches called off after a few days due to weather or dangerous conditions. 17 separate incidents. 43 people vanished without a trace. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the witness reports that had been filed but never investigated. Local fishermen reporting unusual sounds from the glaciers at night. Boat crews seeing pale figures moving on ice floes. Native guides refusing to take clients near certain areas because of bad spirits in the ice. Every report had been filed, documented, and ignored. I was reading through a 1,967 incident file when my radio crackled to life. It was Jerry Morrison, one of the other rangers, calling from the South Patrol area. Margaret, you need to get down here. We found something. What? Kind of something? Just get down here. And bring your camera. I found Jerry at Gull Cove, about 5 miles south of where the kayaks had been discovered. He was standing on the beach next to what looked like a pile of wet clothes. Washed up about an hour ago, he said. Recognize any of it? I knelt down and examined the pile. A blue fleece jacket, size large. Waterproof pants with the tags still attached. A knit cap with anchorage embroidered on the front. It was gear from the missing kayakers. There's more, Jerry said. Look at this. He led me to a tidal pool about 20 yards up the beach. At first I didn't see anything unusual, just water, rocks, and seaweed. Then Jerry pointed to the edge of the pool. There were tracks in the wet sand. Not human tracks, and not from any animal I recognized. They looked almost like handprints, but with too many fingers and what might have been webbing between them. The prints led from the water's edge up to where the clothes had been found, then back to the water. "What do you think made those?" Jerry asked. I stared at the tracks and remembered the pale hand that had grabbed my ankle. "I don't know, some kind of marine mammal maybe." But I was lying. I knew exactly what had made those tracks, and it wasn't any kind of animal that was supposed to exist. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw pale shapes moving through dark water and heard that clicking sound echoing from deep ice. I kept thinking about the missing people, about their gear scattered on a beach like offerings. Around midnight, I heard voices outside my cabin. The voices were calling my name. I sat up in bed and listened. They sounded like the missing kayakers, a man's voice and a woman's voice, maybe the teenage boy too. They were calling for help, saying they were lost and hurt. "Margaret, please help us, we're trapped." I grabbed my flashlight and went to the Bruve window. The voices were coming from the direction of the water, maybe 100 yards from my cabin. I could see shapes moving on the beach in the moonlight. Every instinct told me not to go outside, but those voices sounded so real, so desperate. What if the missing people had somehow made it back? What if they needed medical attention? I put on my boots and jacket and stepped onto the porch. "Where are you?" I called out. "Down here, by the water. Please hurry." The voices were definitely coming from the beach. I could see 3 or 4 figures standing at the water's edge, waving their arms. In the moonlight, they looked like normal people. I started walking toward them, flashlight in hand. As I got closer, something began to feel wrong. The figures were too still when they weren't waving, and their voices carried too clearly across the distance. Sound doesn't travel that well over water and sand. When I was about 50 yards away, I stopped and shined my diff flashlight on them. They weren't people. The shapes were pale and wrong, standing upright but bent in ways that human spines don't bend. Their arms were too long and their heads were too narrow. When my light hit them, they made that clicking sound I'd heard in the cave. Then they started running toward me. I turned and ran back to the cabin as fast as I could. Behind me, I could hear them moving, not footsteps, but a wet sliding sound like fish being dragged across sand. They were fast, much faster than anything human-shaped should be. I made it to the porch and slammed the door behind me, throwing the deadbolt. Something hit the door hard enough to shake the whole cabin. Then another impact, and another. The clicking sounds were coming from all around the cabin now. They were surrounding me. I grabbed my radio and tried to call for help, but got only static. The clicking sounds were interfering with the signal somehow, or maybe they were just too close to the radio tower. A window broke in the back room. I heard them climbing through, making wet sounds as they moved across the floor. I backed into the bathroom and locked the door, but I knew it wouldn't hold them for long. The scratching started immediately, those same parallel gouges I'd seen in the ice cave, but now they were carving through my bathroom door. Wood chips scattered on the floor as 4-inch claws worked their way through the panels. I looked around for anything I could use as a weapon. The bathroom window was too small to climb through, and there was nowhere else to go. In about 30 seconds, they were going to break through the door. That's when I remembered the emergency flare gun in the medicine cabinet. I grabbed it just as the door gave way. The first pale shape pushed through the opening and I pulled the trigger. The flare hit its center mass and burst into brilliant red fire. The thing screamed, a sound like ice cracking, and fell, backward into the others. But there were more of them, many more. I had 1 flare left and at least 6 of those things trying to get into the bathroom. The burned one was rolling on the floor, making horrible noises, but the others just stepped over it and kept coming. I backed against the window and prepared to die. Then I heard the helicopter. The search and rescue chopper came in low over the cabin, spotlight blazing. The pale things froze for a moment, then scattered like roaches when a light comes on. I heard them sliding and splashing as they fled toward the water. The pilot's voice crackled over my handheld radio. "Ranger Frostborn, we saw the flare. Are you injured?" I keyed the microphone with shaking hands. "Negative. But I need immediate evac. There are hostile animals around the cabin." "Roger. Setting down in the clearing behind your position." I waited until I heard the helicopter land before leaving the bathroom. The things had trashed my cabin. Furniture overturned, windows broken, claw marks gouged deep into the walls. But they were gone. The pilot was Lieutenant Davis from the Coast Guard. His crew pulled me aboard and we lifted off immediately. "What happened down there, Ranger?" Davis asked as we gained altitude. I looked down at my destroyed cabin and made a decision. I found where the missing kayakers went, and I know what took them. I told him everything: the cave, the pale hand that grabbed me, the bones by the water, the things that attacked my cabin. Davis listened without interrupting, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. "I know how it sounds," I said, "but those people are dead, and there's something living in these glaciers that killed them." Davis was quiet for a long moment. Then he pointed out the helicopter window. "Look down there." We were flying over the glacier face where I'd first found the kayaks. In the helicopter's spotlight, I could see dozens of pale shapes moving on the ice floes below. They were gathered around dark holes in the ice, openings that led down into the glacier itself. "I've been flying rescue missions in Alaska for 15 years, Davis said. "I've seen things that don't make it into official reports. Whatever those are down there, they're not in any field guide." As we watched, the pale shapes began disappearing into the holes in the ice. Within minutes, the glacier face looked empty and normal again. "What do we do now?" I asked. Davis turned the helicopter toward the mainland. "We file a report recommending that this area be declared off-limits to civilian traffic. Dangerous ice conditions, risk of avalanche, whatever it takes." "And the missing people?" "Lost in a tragic kayaking accident. Bodies never recovered due to severe weather conditions." I knew he was right. Who would believe the truth? And even if they did, what could anyone do about it? You can't arrest something that lives inside a glacier. The official report listed the 5 kayakers as missing and presumed dead, victims of unstable ice conditions during an unusually severe spring breakup. The search was called off after a week, and the area near Muir Glacier was temporarily restricted to authorized personnel only. I spent 3 days in Anchorage being debriefed by Coast Guard officials and park administrators. My story about attacking animals was accepted. Alaska has plenty of dangerous wildlife, and bear attacks on remote cabins aren't unheard of. The fact that no one found any bear tracks or other evidence was explained away by the timing. The tide had come in and washed away most of the evidence. Only Lieutenant Davis and I knew what had really happened. When I returned to Glacier Bay, they assigned me to a different sector. Farther south, away from the ice caves and the deep water where things lived that shouldn't exist. My new cabin had better locks and a direct radio link to headquarters. But I still hear them sometimes, especially on calm nights when the sound carries well across the water, that clicking noise echoing from the glacier face, mixed with voices calling for help. Always voices calling for help. I've done research since then, digging deeper into the old stories and historical records. What I found suggests that the creatures in the ice have been here much longer than human settlement. Tlingit oral traditions going back centuries describe the same pale hunters, the same disappearances near glacial water. The stories say they were once human, people who got trapped in the ice during the Great Freeze and changed into something else. Something adapted to the cold and the dark, something that hunts in packs through tunnels carved in living glaciers. They call to their prey using voices of the dead, luring them into places where there's no escape. The caves connect to a network of passages that runs through the glacier like blood vessels, allowing the creatures to move unseen beneath tons of ice. The spring breakup disrupts their hunting grounds, forcing them closer to the surface. That's when they take the most people: kayakers, researchers, anyone unlucky enough to be on the water when they're feeding. I've recommended that the restricted area around Muir Glacier be made permanent, citing ongoing geological instability. So far, park administration has agreed, but budget cuts and tourism pressure could change that decision anytime. Sometimes I watch the news reports about global warming and melting glaciers. Scientists talk about rising sea levels and changing weather patterns. But they don't mention what else might be released when ancient ice finally melts. The creatures I encountered are probably just the beginning. There are glaciers all over Alaska, some of them thousands of years old. If the ice keeps melting, those deep tunnels are going to connect with the ocean in ways they never have before. Last week, I got a call from a ranger in Kenai Fjords National Park. 3 fishing boats had been found empty near a glacier face, their crews missing. The Coast Guard listed it as a tragic accident, sudden weather, possibly a rogue wave. But the ranger mentioned something in his preliminary report that made my blood run cold. Scratches on the sides of the boats, parallel gouges that looked like claw marks, and sounds echoing from ice caves at night, clicking sounds mixed with voices calling for help. I told him I'd drive down next week to consult on the search efforts. I didn't tell him what he's really dealing with, because he wouldn't believe me until he sees it for himself. Nobody ever does. But maybe I can save the next group of kayakers who decide to explore those ice caves. Maybe I can warn them before they get close enough to hear the voices calling their names. Because the creatures in the ice are still there, still hunting, still patient. They've had thousands of years to perfect their methods, and they're not going anywhere. The glacier's children are hungry, and they're waiting for the next warm spell to bring fresh prey within reach. I just hope they don't figure out how to hunt on dry land. My name is David Starwatcher, and I've been a park ranger in Alaska for 17 years. People always ask about my last name. My grandmother gave it to me when I was little. She said I spent too much time looking up at the sky instead of watching where I walked. I work in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, way up north where most people never go. It's the biggest piece of wild land left in America. During winter, the sun doesn't come up for weeks. Just endless darkness and cold that can freeze your breath before it leaves your mouth. I'm 41 now, and I used to be a college teacher before this job. I taught kids about stars and planets. But I got tired of being stuck inside all day. I wanted to see the real sky, not just pictures in books, so I became a ranger. My mom was Gwich'in. That's a native tribe from up here. She died when I was 12. But she taught me some of our old stories. Stories about spirits that dance in the northern lights. I never believed them, though. I'm a science guy. I know the aurora is just particles from the sun hitting our atmosphere. The other rangers think I'm weird, because I still go out on patrol during the polar night. Most people hunker down in town during the dark months, but January is when the northern lights are strongest. It's the best time to see them dance across the sky in green and blue waves. This year, something was different though. The lights were brighter than I'd ever seen. They moved faster too. Almost like they were alive. It was January 15th when I got the call on my radio. A research team from the university had gone missing. 5 people studying the aurora. They'd been camping about 50 miles north of my station, right in the middle of nowhere. Dave, you copy? It was my boss, Chief Ranger Martinez, calling from Fairbanks. I'm here, Chief. We lost contact with the Aurora research team 3 days ago. Last check-in was Friday night. Their GPS beacon went dead. Saturday morning. I looked out my cabin window. The sky was dancing with green fire. The lights were so bright I could read by them. Weather's been clear, I said. No storms to knock out their equipment. That's what worries me. Can you head out there and check on them? I packed my gear while the aurora twisted overhead. My snowmobile had enough fuel for the round trip, plus extra. I brought my emergency radio, GPS, sleeping bag, and enough food for 3 days. Standard stuff. But as I loaded my rifle, I thought about my grandmother's stories. She used to say the lights were spirits of people who died hunting. They danced in the sky because they couldn't find their way home. Silly old stories, I told myself as I started the snowmobile. The ride north took 4 hours through country so empty it made you feel like the last person alive. Just flat white tundra stretching forever under the dancing lights. My snowmobile's headlight cut a tiny bubble of yellow in all that darkness. The temperature was 45 below zero. Even through my heavy parka and face mask, the cold tried to crawl inside me. But I'd done this trip hundreds of times. I knew how to stay warm and alive. I found their camp just after midnight. 5 bright orange tents arranged in a circle around a central area where they'd been working. But something was wrong. The tents were still standing, but they flapped in the wind like empty skin. No lights inside, no sounds of people sleeping. I killed my snowmobile engine and listened. Just wind across the snow and the faint crackling sound the aurora makes when it's really strong. Most people don't know, northern lights make noise. It sounds like distant electricity. I called out, "Hello, anybody here?" Nothing. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the nearest tent. My boots crunched in the snow, way too loud in all that quiet. The tent zipper was open, which was weird. Nobody leaves their tent open in this cold. You'd freeze to death in minutes. I looked inside. Sleeping bag was there. Personal stuff scattered around. But no person. Same thing with the other 4 tents. All empty, but their gear was still there. Food, clothes, expensive research equipment. Nobody just walks away from that stuff in the Arctic. You need it to live. In the center of their camp, I found their main research station. Computers and instruments, all set up to study the aurora. The screens were still on, which meant the generators were running. But the data on the screens looked wrong. Just lines going crazy, like the instruments were broken. That's when I noticed the tracks. The tracks started at the research station and headed north across the tundra. 5 sets of boots, walking in a perfect line. But here's the weird part. The tracks didn't look right. They were the right size for human feet, but they were too far apart. Like the people were taking steps twice as long as normal. I followed them with my flashlight beam. The tracks went straight as an arrow for about 100 yards, then just stopped, in the middle of nowhere. No sign of where the people went after that. Above me, the aurora was going crazy. Bright green curtains dancing and spinning way faster than I'd ever seen. And the crackling sound was getting louder. It almost sounded like voices whispering, but I knew that was just my brain trying to make sense of random noise. I went back to the camp and tried their radio equipment. Nothing but static. My own radio wasn't working either, even though it had been fine during the ride. All I got was a weird humming sound that made my teeth ache. The smart thing would have been to head back to my station and call for help. But I kept thinking about those 5 missing people. In this cold, they'd be dead in hours without shelter. If they were still alive somewhere, I might be their only chance. I decided to spend the night in one of their tents and start searching again in the morning. I dragged my sleeping bag into the biggest tent and fired up a small camp stove for warmth. The little flame made me feel less alone. That's when I heard the singing. It started soft, like wind through ice. But as I listened closer, it sounded more like human voices. Multiple people singing together, but not in any language I knew. The sound seemed to come from the sky, mixed in with the aurora's crackling. I poked my head out of the tent. The northern lights were directly overhead now, a huge spinning circle of green and blue. And the singing was definitely coming from up there. As the lights danced, the voices got louder and softer, like they were connected somehow. I grabbed my camera and started taking pictures. The images came out weird. Instead of the normal streams of light I expected, the photos showed shapes in the aurora. Almost like people dancing, with long flowing hair and outstretched arms. Just pareidolia, I told myself. That's the scientific word for when your brain sees faces in clouds or Jesus in your toast. I'm just stressed and seeing things that aren't there. But then one of the shapes in the aurora looked down at me. I'm not talking about a random swirl of light that kind of looked like a face. I mean it had eyes, and it looked right at me. I could feel its attention like cold fingers on my neck. I dropped the camera and scrambled back into the tent. My hands were shaking as I zipped it shut. The singing got louder, more excited, like the things in the sky knew I'd seen them. I lay in my sleeping bag with my rifle across my chest, listening to those voices. They sang in harmony, rising and falling like ocean waves, beautiful but wrong somehow, like a lullaby that wants to put you to sleep forever. Around 3 a.m, the singing stopped. The aurora faded to a dull glow, and normal darkness returned. I must have dozed off then because the next thing I knew, pale daylight was seeping through the tent walls. I climbed out and looked around. The camp looked the same as before, but something had changed during the night. New tracks in the snow, not human this time. These were long grooves, like something had been dragged across the ground. The grooves led from each empty tent toward the center of camp, and in the center, where the research station had been, there was just a perfect circle of bare ground. No snow, no equipment, no sign that anything had ever been there. The earth was dark and warm to the touch, even though the air was still way below freezing. That's when I found the first body. Dr. Sarah Chen was about 50 yards from camp, lying face up in the snow. I recognized her from the team photo they'd sent us. She looked peaceful, like she was just sleeping. But her eyes were open, staring at the sky with an expression I'd never seen before. Not fear or pain, more like wonder. Like she'd seen something beautiful right before she died. There were no wounds on her body, no signs of violence. But her skin was pale as ice, and when I touched her hand, it felt warm. Not normal, warm. Hot, like she had a fever, but she'd been dead for hours. I found the others scattered across the tundra. All of them face up, all with that same peaceful expression. All of them impossibly warm despite being dead in the snow for who knows how long. The last one I found was Dr. Marcus Webb, the team leader. He was clutching a notebook in his frozen hands. I had to break his fingers to get it loose. The last entry was written in shaky handwriting. Asterisk, the aurora responded to our electromagnetic pulse experiment. It's not just particles. There's intelligence in the lights. They're coming down. They want to dance with us. Sarah says she can hear them singing. I can too now. It's beautiful. We're going to join them. Asterisk. Below that he'd drawn a picture. 5 stick figures holding hands, floating up toward wavy lines that must have been the northern lights. Like kids going to heaven. I radioed back to base, but my equipment still wasn't working right. Just that same humming noise that made my skull vibrate. I took photos of everything, packed up my gear, and got ready to head back to my station. But as I started my snowmobile, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. New snowmobile tracks in the snow, running parallel to mine. Someone else had been here during the night. Someone else was following me. The ride back to my station felt like the longest 4 hours of my life. I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see headlights following me across the tundra. But there was nothing back there except darkness and dancing aurora. My station is a small log cabin on a hill overlooking the Beaufort Sea. It's got solar panels, a radio antenna, and enough supplies to last through the worst weather. Home sweet home in the middle of nowhere. But when I got there, I knew something was wrong. My generator was running, which meant someone had started it while I was gone. I always shut it down when I leave to save fuel. I approached the cabin with my rifle ready. The windows were dark, but I could see a faint glow coming from inside. Not electric light. Something else. Something that pulsed green and blue, like the aurora. The front door was open. Not broken open, just open like someone had walked in and forgotten to close it. I called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" But got no answer. Inside, everything looked normal at first. My furniture was all in the right places. My food was still in the cabinets. But the air felt different. Charged, like right before a lightning storm. The glow was coming from my radio equipment. All the screens were on, showing the same crazy data patterns I'd seen at the research camp. But my radio had been turned off when I left. Someone had turned it on. Or something had. I tried to call for help, but the radio just made that humming noise again. It was louder now, almost like music, and underneath it, I could hear voices. Faint whispers, in that same unknown language I'd heard the night before. I was taking pictures of the radio displays when I heard my snowmobile start up outside. I ran to the window just in time to see my machine disappearing into the darkness, moving by itself, no rider. Just the snowmobile gliding away across the snow like a ghost. Now, I was really stranded. The nearest help was 300 miles away, and I had no way to get there. My only hope was getting the radio working again. I spent the next hour trying to fix it, but everything I did just made the humming louder. The sound was starting to hurt my ears, and I was getting a headache that felt like someone driving nails into my skull. That's when I remembered my grandmother's stories. She used to tell me about the Yagatuun, the dancing spirits of the aurora. According to the old tales, they were the souls of hunters who had died in the wilderness. They danced in the sky because they were lost and couldn't find their way to the spirit world. But some stories said the Yagatuun weren't lost at all. They were hunting, looking for living people to join their endless dance in the sky. Just stories, I told myself. But as the humming grew louder and the aurora blazed brighter outside my windows, I wasn't so sure anymore. Around midnight, the temperature inside my cabin started dropping. Not slowly, like when the heating fails. Fast, like someone had opened a freezer door to space. My breath began fogging, and frost started forming on the windows. The humming stopped, In the sudden silence, I could hear something moving around outside, footsteps in the snow, circling the cabin. But they didn't sound right. Too light, like whatever was making them barely weighed anything at all. I grabbed my rifle and peered out the window. The aurora was directly overhead again, spinning in. That same perfect circle I'd seen the night before. And in its light, I could see shapes moving around my cabin. They looked like people at first glance. But as my eyes adjusted, I could see they weren't quite human. Too tall and thin, with arms that hung down past their knees. They moved in perfect synchronization, like they were all part of the same organism. And they glowed with the same green-blue light as the aurora. One of them looked up at my window, and I saw its face. It had been Dr. Sarah Chen once, but not anymore. Her features were stretched and distorted, and her eyes blazed with aurora light. When she smiled at me, her teeth were too sharp and too many. The thing that had been Dr. Chen raised one impossibly long arm and pointed at me. The others turned to look, and I saw they had all been members of the research team, but changed. Transformed into something that wasn't human anymore. They began to sing. It was the same melody I'd heard the night before, but now I could hear the words. They were singing in my language now, in English, and the song was about dancing and flying and never feeling cold again. "Come outside, David," they sang in harmony. "Come dance with us. Come see how beautiful it is up there." The temperature in my cabin kept dropping. The frost on the windows was getting thicker, and I could see my breath in white puffs. The aurora light was getting brighter too, seeping through the glass like liquid electricity. I backed away from the window and bumped into my kitchen table. That's when I noticed my coffee mug was floating 6 inches off the surface, glowing with the same aurora light as the things outside. The electromagnetic field was getting stronger, strong enough to affect metal objects, strong enough to make my compass spin like a pinwheel, and it was centered on my cabin. They wanted me to come outside. They wanted me to join their dance. But I remembered something else from my grandmother's stories. The Yagatoon could only take you if you went to them willingly, if you joined their dance by choice. "Not gonna happen," I said out loud, just to hear a human voice. That's when they started trying to get inside. The singing stopped, and I heard them moving around the cabin walls. Not walking anymore. Flowing, like water or wind, making soft scratching sounds against the logs. My windows began to rattle in their frames. The aurora light outside got brighter and brighter until it was like having the sun press against the glass, but it was cold light that made everything it touched turn blue and terrible. Then the whispers started again. But now they were coming from inside the cabin, from the walls, from the ceiling, from the very air around me. All in my grandmother's voice. "David, baby, don't be scared. It's so beautiful up here. No more cold, no more loneliness, just dancing forever in the lights." I knew it wasn't really her. My grandmother had been dead for 20 years. But hearing her voice made something break inside my chest. The radio equipment flared to life again, and this time the screens showed clear images. Video feeds from the research team's last days. I watched Dr. Chen and the others setting up their experiment, trying to bounce electromagnetic pulses off the aurora to study its structure. I watched the moment their equipment actually made contact with something in the lights. The aurora twisted down toward their camp like a green tornado, and things that looked almost human stepped out of the spinning light. The researchers weren't scared, they were amazed. They reached out to touch the aurora beings, and the moment they made contact, their expressions changed. Their eyes began to glow, and they started moving differently. Like puppets with someone else pulling the strings. The video showed them walking away from camp in that perfect line, their feet barely touching the snow. They walked until they bare of it, reached a spot of open ground, then they just lifted off, rose into the air like balloons, and dissolved into the dancing lights. But they weren't gone, they were transformed, turned into something that lived in the electromagnetic fields of the aurora, feeding on the electrical activity in human brains. The whispers got louder. Now they were all talking at once, my grandmother, my mother, my dead father, all the people I'd ever lost. All of them telling me how wonderful it was to be free of flesh and bone, to dance forever in the sky. My rifle was getting warm in my hands. The metal barrel was starting to glow with that same aurora light. The electromagnetic field was so strong now that it was affecting everything metal in the cabin. The nails in the walls were heating up. The temperature paradox hit me. Outside was freezing, but inside my metal objects were getting hot enough to burn. I dropped the rifle before it could blister my palms. That's when the real attack began. The aurora light punched through my windows like living things. Tentacles of green fire wrapped around my arms and legs, trying to drag me outside. Where they touched, my skin tingled and then went numb. I fought back, pulling against their grip, but it was like fighting electricity itself. Every time I broke free from one tentacle, two more took its place. The things outside started singing again, but now their voices were inside my head, not coming through my ears, but vibrating directly in my skull. The song was about letting go, about how tired I must be from fighting, about how easy it would be to just float away. And the horrible thing was, they were right. I was tired of being alone out here in the cold, tired of 17 years with no one but myself for company, tired of pretending I didn't miss my family, didn't miss having people to care about. The aurora tentacles stopped pulling and started gently stroking, like someone trying to comfort a crying child. You don't have to be alone anymore, the voices whispered. We're a family now, all of us together, dancing forever. I almost gave in. The numbness was spreading up my arms, and it felt warm and safe, like sinking into a hot bath after hours in the cold. But then I remembered something my grandmother told me when I was little. She said the Yagatuné weren't evil, just lost. They had forgotten how to find their way home to the spirit world, so they tried to fill the emptiness with the living. But, she had said, if you know the old songs, if you remember the right dances, you can show them the path they've forgotten. I started to sing. It was a song my mother taught me when I was 5 years old, a traditional Gwich'in song about the aurora. I'd always thought it was just a pretty melody, but now I understood it was something else. A map. A set of directions for spirits lost in the sky. As I sang, the aurora tentacles loosened their grip. The things outside stopped their own singing and listened. I could feel their attention shift, like predators hearing an unexpected sound. I kept singing and started to dance. Just simple steps my mother had shown me, movements that were supposed to mimic the aurora's own patterns. I felt ridiculous, dancing alone in my cabin while electromagnetic monsters tried to steal my soul. But it was working. The aurora light began to change color, shifting from that cold green-blue to warmer hues. Gold and red and purple, like a sunset. The tentacles released me completely and withdrew through the windows. Outside, I could see the transformed research team standing in the snow, but they looked different now, more human, less distorted. The aurora light in their eyes was fading, and expressions of confusion were replacing the empty hunger. Dr. Chen looked at her hands like she'd never seen them before. Doctor. Webb was looking around the clearing like he couldn't remember how he'd gotten there. They were coming back. The song was helping them remember who they used to be. I opened my cabin door and stepped outside, still singing, still dancing. The cold hit me like a physical blow, but I kept moving. The aurora overhead was shifting too, its wild spinning slowing to a gentler rhythm. The 5 researchers looked at me with growing recognition in their eyes. They were still glowing faintly, still not quite human, but they were more themselves than they'd been since the transformation. David? Doctor. Chen's voice was her own again, confused but real. What happened to us? But even as she spoke, I could see the aurora light starting to return to her eyes. The transformation wasn't permanent yet, but it was getting stronger. Whatever the electromagnetic beings were, they didn't give up their prey easily. I had to finish this now, while the song still had power. I sang the last verse of my mother's aurora song, the part about spirits finding their way home. And as I sang, I pointed north toward the magnetic pole, toward the place where the aurora was strongest. The lights in the sky began to move, streaming northward like a river of fire, and the glow around the researchers began to move with it, pulling away from their bodies like smoke in the wind. For a moment, I saw them. The real Yagatuné. Not the transformed researchers, but the original spirits. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, caught between the human world and whatever came after. They looked grateful as they flowed north with the aurora, finally knowing which way was home. Dr. Chen and the others collapsed in the snow as the last of the aurora light left them. Human again, but unconscious from the ordeal. Above us, the northern lights were fading to their normal gentle dance. I got them all inside my cabin and wrapped them in every blanket I could find. They were hypothermic but alive, their pulses steady and strong. Dr. Chen woke up first, around dawn. "David," she whispered, were we really flying?" "You were lost," I told her. "But you found your way back." They all had fragmentary memories of their transformation. Floating in the aurora, feeling connected to something vast and electric. Dr. Webb said it was like being part of a living constellation, every star a consciousness sharing the same endless dance. "It was beautiful," Dr. Chen said, "but it wasn't human anymore. We were forgetting who we used to be." My radio started working again as soon as the electromagnetic interference faded. I called for a rescue helicopter, and by noon, we were all on our way back to civilization. The medical team said they'd never seen anything like the researchers' condition, hypothermic but with no frostbite, exhausted but with brain activity that looked more like they'd been in deep meditation than near death. The official report said the team got lost in a whiteout and suffered from shared hypothermia-induced hallucinations. Their equipment malfunctioned during an aurora storm, and they wandered around confused until I found them. Nobody mentioned the transformed beings or the electromagnetic predators living in the northern lights. Who would believe it? But I put together a new protocol for the Park Service. During periods of intense aurora activity, no research teams work alone in the field. All electromagnetic experiments require supervision, and any signs of unusual aurora behavior get reported immediately to me. Because the thing is, the Yagatuna aren't gone forever. I helped the lost spirits find their way home, but the aurora itself is still there. Still crackling with electricity, still beautiful and alien and hungry. And sometimes, on the brightest nights when the lights dance directly overhead, I can hear faint whispers in the radio static. Not threatening anymore, just curious. Like something in the sky wondering what it would be like to be. I've been doing this job for 17 years, and I thought I knew everything about survival in the Arctic. But I learned something new out there. The most dangerous predator isn't a bear or the cold. It's loneliness. The Yagatun weren't evil, they were just lost and empty, trying to fill themselves with the warmth of human connection. And the scariest part is, I understand why Dr. Chen and the others went with them so willingly. Out here in the wilderness, when you're surrounded by endless darkness and cold, the idea of joining something larger than yourself, of never being alone again, it's tempting. More tempting than it should be. I still go out on patrol during the polar nights, but now I sing my grandmother's songs while I work, and I always carry a photo of my family in my pocket. Little reminders of who I am and where I belong. The aurora is beautiful, but it's not home. And on the clearest nights, when the lights dance in perfect spirals, overhead, I swear I can see them. The spirits I helped find their way north. They wave to me sometimes, grateful shadows in the cosmic fire. They're not hunting anymore. They're just dancing, but they're always watching, always waiting, just in case someone else gets lost up there in the dark. My name is Elena Nighthawk. I've been a park ranger for 15 years, and I've seen things in the wilderness that would make your skin crawl. But nothing prepared me for what happened in the gates of the Arctic that November. I'm part Athabascan, born and raised in Alaska. My grandmother used to tell stories about the Wendigo. Hungry giants that eat people when winter gets too hard. I always thought they were just tales to scare kids into staying close to camp. I was wrong. The call came in on November 3rd, 1983. I was sitting in my cabin at the ranger station, drinking coffee and watching snow fall outside my window. The radio crackled to life. "Elena, we got a problem," came the voice of my supervisor, Jim Morrison. "Lost contact with that geological survey team up in the Kobuk River Valley. Been 4 days since their last check-in." I set down my mug. Survey teams were supposed to radio in every morning. 4 days was bad news in country like this. "Weather been keeping planes out?" "Nah. Pete flew over their camp yesterday. Says it looks abandoned, but their gear's still there. Need you to hike in and check it out." I looked outside at the blowing snow. The temperature gauge on my porch read -28 degrees. Not the worst I'd seen, but bad enough. How many people we talking about? 6. Dr. Sarah Chen leading the team. They're mapping mineral deposits for the university. I knew Dr. Chen, smart woman, been in Alaska before, not the type to wander off without good reason. I'll head out first thing tomorrow. That night, I packed my gear with extra care. Sleeping bag rated for -40. Emergency food for 2 weeks. Flare gun, my grandfather's old rifle, a Winchester Model 70 that had never let me down. Something felt wrong about this whole situation, though I couldn't put my finger on what. I'd been working in gates of the Arctic for 8 years. It's raw country, 9 million acres of wilderness with no roads, no trails, no nothing. Just endless tundra, scattered patches of spruce trees, and silence so deep it makes your ears ring. Most people can't handle the emptiness. It drives them a little crazy. But I loved it. After 12 years in the Air Force, teaching survival training, the quiet felt like home. I knew how to read the signs, which way the wind would turn, where the caribou would migrate when a storm was coming. The land spoke to me in ways most people wouldn't understand. Still, as I loaded my backpack that night, my hands were shaking a little. Not from cold, from something else. My grandmother's stories kept creeping into my mind. She used to say the Wendigo came when people got so hungry they'd do anything to survive, when they crossed the line that shouldn't be crossed. The thing about being Athabascan is that our stories aren't just entertainment, they're warnings. I tried to push the thoughts away. This was 1983. Not 1883. People didn't just vanish anymore. There had to be a reasonable explanation. I radioed Jim one more time before bed. Any word on what kind of wildlife activity's been reported in that area? Funny you should ask. Old trapper named Moses Tutu came through last week. Says, the animals have been acting strange up there. Caribou running south early, ravens won't land, that sort of thing. Moses was traditional Athabascan, like my grandmother. If he said the animals were spooked, they were spooked. Animals know things we don't. Any idea what's got them stirred up? Moses just said the land feels hungry. You know how he talks. I did know. Moses spoke in the old way, where everything had spirit and meaning. Most people dismissed him as superstitious, but I'd learned to listen. In 15 years of wilderness work, the old-timers had never steered me wrong. That night I couldn't sleep well. Wind kept howling around the cabin, and every time I dozed off, I'd dream about my grandmother's wrinkled hands drawing shapes in the air as she told her stories. In the dreams, her voice was urgent, like she was trying to warn me about something. When morning came, the sky was clear and hard as blue glass. Perfect flying weather, but the kind of cold that made your lungs ache. I loaded my gear into the helicopter and settled in for the flight north. The pilot was a guy named Rick I'd flown with before. Good man, knew the country. As we lifted off, he handed me a thermos of coffee. Heard about the missing survey team, he said through the headphones. Strange thing is, I flew a supply drop to them just 6 days ago. They seemed fine then. Doctor? Chen waved at me when I landed. I watched the landscape roll by below us. Rolling hills covered in snow, patches of stunted trees, frozen lakes that looked like scattered mirrors. Beautiful and deadly in equal measure. They say anything unusual when you drop supplies? Well, now that you mention it, yeah, Dr. Chen. Asked if I'd seen any other people in the area. Said they'd heard voices at night but couldn't find anyone when they went looking. That made my stomach tighten. Voices in the wilderness usually meant one of two things. Either someone was lost and calling for help, or you were hearing things that weren't there. Neither option was good. 45 minutes later, Rick set the helicopter down on a ridge overlooking the survey team's camp. From the air, everything looked normal. 6 tents arranged in a neat circle, equipment stacked under tarps, even a campfire ring with what looked like fresh ashes. But something was wrong. I could feel it the moment I stepped out of the helicopter. The silence was too complete. No birds, no small animal sounds, nothing, just the whisper of wind across snow. In all my years in the bush, I'd never heard quiet like that. You want me to wait? Rick asked, keeping the rotors turning. I looked down at the camp, then at the vast emptiness, stretching in every direction. Part of me wanted to say yes, to have him wait right there while I took a quick look around. But fuel was expensive, and I might need to stay overnight to figure out what happened. No, go ahead. Pick me up in 3 days unless you hear otherwise on the radio. Rick nodded and lifted off, the sound of the helicopter fading until there was nothing left but that terrible silence. I shouldered my pack and started down toward the camp, my boots crunching in the snow. With each step, the feeling of wrongness grew stronger. It was like walking into a house where something bad had happened. You could feel it in the air, even if you couldn't see what it was. By the time I reached the first tent, my hand was resting on the grip of my pistol, though I couldn't have said why. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Not death. I would have recognized that right away. Something else. Something wrong. Like meat that had been left out too long, but mixed with an animal musk so strong it made my nose burn. Dr. Chen's tent was the largest one, set up as a command center. I called out before unzipping the flap. Dr. Chen? Elena, Nighthawk, Park Service. No answer. I pulled the zipper down and looked inside. Everything was neat and organized. Sleeping bag rolled up tight, research papers stacked in careful piles, camp stove clean and ready to use. But there was a coffee mug sitting on the folding table, still half full. When I touched it, ice crystals cracked on the surface. I backed out of the tent and tried the next one. Same thing, perfectly organized, but abandoned suddenly. In the third tent, I found something that made my blood run cold. Claw marks. 4 deep gouges raked across the tent wall from outside, like something had tried to get in, but the material wasn't torn. The claws had been pulled back, like whatever made them had changed its mind. I knelt down to look at the marks more closely. They were huge. Each gouge was 8 inches long and cut clean through 2 layers of heavy nylon. No bear could make marks like that. No animal I knew of could. Hello? I called out, loud as I could. Anyone out there? This is Park Service. My voice echoed off the hills and died away. Nothing called back. I spent the next hour going through the entire camp. 6 tents, all abandoned the same way. Personal items left behind, sleeping bags still warm enough that they hadn't been empty long. But no sign of the people themselves. In the center of camp, I found their equipment cache. Expensive stuff, computers, geological samples, scientific instruments worth thousands of dollars, all sitting there untouched. Whatever happened, it wasn't robbery. The strangest thing was the campfire. Fresh ashes, like someone had built a fire that morning. But when I sifted through them with a stick, I found something that made my stomach turn. Bones. Small ones, burned black and cracked from heat. At first I thought they might be from fish or rabbits. Then I found a piece that was unmistakably human, part of a finger bone with what looked like teeth marks on it. I sat back on my heels, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. People didn't just eat each other. Not in 1983, not with plenty of food supplies sitting right there in their cache, but the evidence was right there in the ashes. Someone in that camp had cooked and eaten human flesh. I was still kneeling by the fire pit when I heard it. A voice, calling from somewhere in the trees. Help me, please, someone help me. It was faint and distant, but definitely human. A woman's voice, full of pain and fear. I grabbed my rifle and headed toward the sound. The voice seemed to be coming from a grove of stunted spruce trees about 200 yards from camp. As I got closer, I could hear it more clearly. I'm hurt, please, I can't move, help me. I recognized the voice now. Dr. Sarah Chen, the bully, team leader. She sounded like she was in bad shape, weak and scared. Dr. Chen? This is Elena Nighthawk, Park Service. I'm coming to get you. I pushed through the trees, following the sound of her voice. But the deeper I went into the grove, the stranger things became. The trees were damaged, bark stripped away in long spirals, branches broken and hanging. Some of the damage was fresh, but some looked old, like something had been working on these trees for weeks. Help me. Please help me. The voice was closer now, maybe 50 yards ahead. But something was wrong with it. The words were right, but they came too regularly. Like someone playing a recording over and over. No person in real distress would call for help exactly the same way every 30 seconds. I stopped walking and listened more carefully. Between the calls for help, I could hear something else. A rustling sound, like something large moving through the trees. But it moved wrong, too fluid, too quiet, for anything that big. Dr. Chen, can you tell me where you are exactly? I called out. The voice stopped. Complete silence for almost a minute. Then, help me. Please, someone help me. Exactly the same words, exactly the same tone. Like a tape being played back. That's when I knew I wasn't dealing with Dr. Chen at all. Something was using her voice to draw me deeper into the trees. Something that had learned to copy human speech perfectly. I backed away slowly, keeping my rifle ready. The voice followed me, always staying just out of sight behind the damaged trees. Every few steps, I'd hear that same call for help, getting fainter as I put distance between myself and whatever was making it. By the time I got back to the camp, my heart was hammering against my ribs. I'd spent 15 years in wilderness, and I'd never run into anything like that. Animals don't mimic human voices. They just don't. I set up my tent as far from the tree line as possible and built a fire as the sun started to go down. The temperature was dropping fast, probably hit -40 by midnight. But the cold wasn't what worried me. As darkness fell, I heard more voices. First, it was Dr. Chen again, calling from a different direction. Then a man's voice, shouting like he was trying to scare something away. Then what sounded like a child crying. Though I knew there were no children in the survey team, I sat by my fire with the rifle across my knees, listening to the voices circle my camp. Sometimes they'd call my name, sometimes they'd beg for help. Once, I heard what sounded like my grandmother's voice, singing an old Athabascan song I hadn't heard since I was little. But I never saw anything. Just darkness beyond the circle of firelight, and voices that shouldn't exist. Around midnight, the voices stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. I kept the fire burning bright and didn't close my eyes until dawn started to break in the east. When morning came, I found tracks in the snow around my camp. They were huge. Each footprint was almost 2 feet long and shaped like a human foot, but stretched and wrong. The stride was impossible, covering 12 feet between steps. Whatever made them had to be enormous. The tracks circled my camp 3 times, always staying just outside the range of my firelight. In one place, they came right up to where I'd hung my food bag in a tree. The bag was gone, rope chewed through about 10 feet up. I followed the tracks as far as I dared. They led back into the spruce grove, then just stopped, like whatever made them had vanished into thin air. That's when I found the first body, Dr. Marcus Webb, according to his ID. He was lying face down in a clearing about half a mile from camp. At first I thought he'd frozen to death, but when I rolled him over, I saw the truth. His neck had been broken. Not by a fall or an accident. Something had grabbed his head and twisted it, completely around. The bone had snapped clean through. But that wasn't the worst part. Someone, or something, had been feeding on him. Chunks of flesh had been torn away from his arms and legs. The wounds were ragged, like they'd been made by teeth instead of tools. I knelt there in the snow, looking at what was left of Dr. Webb, and finally understood what I was dealing with. My grandmother's stories came flooding back. Tales of the Wendigo, the cannibalistic giant that appeared in times of starvation and desperation. The thing that could mimic human voices to lure its prey. The thing that grew stronger every time it fed on human flesh. I was 150 miles from help, alone in the wilderness, with something that shouldn't exist. Something that had already killed at least one person and was hunting for more. As I knelt there beside Dr. Webb's body, I heard that familiar voice calling from the trees. Help me, please, someone help me. But this time, it sounded exactly like me. I ran. There's no shame in admitting it. When you hear your own voice calling for help from something you can't see, every survival instinct you have screams at you to get away, fast. I made it back to camp in record time, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. My hands shook as I grabbed the radio and tried to raise Jim back at headquarters. Base, this is Elena. Emergency. Need immediate extraction. Static. I tried different frequencies, checked the antenna, even smacked the radio a few times. Nothing but dead air. The thing was working fine yesterday when I'd checked in. Now it was useless. That's when I noticed the bite marks on the antenna wire. Something had chewed through the cable, but not randomly. The cuts were precise, like whatever did it understood exactly what the radio was for. It didn't want me calling for help. I was stranded until Rick came back to pick me up in 2 days. 2 days alone with something that could perfectly mimic human voices and had already killed at least one person. I spent the rest of the morning searching for the other team members. What I found made my blood turn to ice. Dr. Jennifer Walsh was in her sleeping bag inside her tent, like she'd died peacefully in her sleep. But when I checked her pulse, I found the same broken neck as Dr. Webb. Her killer had been careful to arrange things so she looked natural from outside. Dr. James Martinez was harder to find. I tracked his footprints from camp to a frozen stream about a mile away. The prints showed he'd been running, stumbling through snowdrifts like something was chasing him. At the stream bank, the snow was torn up from a struggle. I found pieces of his clothing scattered around, bloody and shredded, but no body, just a dark stain in the snow and drag marks leading toward the mountains. 3 down, 3 still missing. As I followed the drag marks, I started to understand how the thing hunted. It was smart, scary smart. It had taken the team members one by one, probably over several nights, used their voices to confuse and separate the others, made them think their friends were calling for help when they were already dead. The drag marks led to a cave in the hillside, partially hidden by fallen rocks. The smell that came from inside was so bad I had to tie a bandana over my nose and mouth. I clicked on my flashlight and stepped inside. The cave went back further than my light could reach. The floor was covered with bones, some animal, some human. Piled against one wall were backpacks, clothes, and personal items from at least a dozen different people. This thing had been hunting in these mountains for years, maybe decades. In the back of the cave, I found Dr. Martinez. What was left of him. The thing had been feeding on him for days, keeping him alive as long as possible. I won't describe what I saw back there. Some things are better left, buried in memory. But Martinez was still breathing. Barely. "Elena?" he whispered when he saw my light. You have to get out of here. It's not human." "I'm going to get you help," I told him, though we both knew it was too late. "No." His hand grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "Listen to me. It learns. Every time it feeds, it gets smarter. Stronger. It's been using our voices. Drawing us out one by one." He coughed, and dark blood came up. "Sarah and Mike, they're still alive somewhere. It's keeping them, saving them. Where? I don't know. But Elena," his grip tightened, "it knows about you now. It's been listening to everything you say, everything you do. It's learning how to be you." That's when I heard my own voice echoing from deeper in the cave. "I'm going to get you help. Listen to me. You have to get out of here." Perfect copies of things I'd just said, played back in my exact tone and accent. The thing was in the cave with us, somewhere in the darkness beyond my flashlight beam. "Run," Martinez breathed. "Don't let it learn any more." I wanted to stay with him, to try and help somehow. But he was right. Every second I spent talking was giving the creature more of my voice to copy. I squeezed his hand once and got out of there. Outside the cave, I heard my voice calling after me, begging me to come back and help. The sound made my skin crawl. I hiked back to camp as fast as I could, but by the time I got there, the sun was already setting. I had one more night to survive before Rick came to pick me up. One more night, with something that now sounded exactly like me. I built my fire bigger than before and arranged my gear in a tight circle around it. The creature had shown it was smart enough to stay out of the firelight, but I wasn't taking any chances. As darkness fell, the voices started again. First it was Martinez, calling out like he was still alive and needed help. Then Dr. Chen's voice. Then Dr. Walsh's. But now there was a new voice mixed in with the others. Mine. "Help me, something's wrong, I'm lost." The thing was using my voice to call for rescue, probably hoping to lure in other hikers or search parties. It had learned that mimicking distress was an effective hunting strategy. But it wasn't perfect yet. The timing was slightly off, and it repeated the same phrases too often. It was still learning how to be human. Around midnight, I heard footsteps circling my camp. Not the huge prints from before, but normal human-sized steps. When I looked toward the sounds, I saw a shadow moving just outside the firelight. "Elena?" My own voice called from the darkness. "Elena, is that you? I've been looking for you everywhere." The shadow stepped closer, and I caught a glimpse of what was making it. It looked like me. Same height, same build, Same ranger uniform. But the proportions were wrong. Arms too long, head tilted. At an odd angle, movements too fluid and graceful for a human. "Don't come any closer," I called out, raising my rifle. The thing stopped. When it spoke again, it used Dr. Chen's voice. "Elena, it's me, Sarah. I escaped from whatever that thing was. Please, I'm hurt. I need help." I kept the rifle trained on the shadow. "Prove it. Tell me something only Dr. Chen would know." Silence for a long moment. Then my voice again. "I don't understand. Elena, it's me. I've been looking for you everywhere." It was stuck in a loop, repeating the same phrases because that's all it knew how to say in my voice. Like a broken recording player. "You're not Elena," I said, "and you're not Dr. Chen. I know what you are." The shadow moved closer, just to the edge of my firelight. For one horrible second, I could see it clearly. It was wearing my face, but the features were stretched and wrong. Too many teeth in the mouth, eyes that reflected light like an animal's, skin that looked like it had been pulled over, something that wasn't quite the right shape. "Wendigo," I whispered. The thing's head snapped up when I said the word. It let out a sound that was part growl, part scream, and completely inhuman. Then it melted back into the darkness, moving faster than anything that size should be able to move. I kept the fire burning bright and didn't sleep a minute that night. Every shadow could be hiding the creature, and every sound might be it practicing new voices it had stolen from its victims. When dawn finally came, I found fresh tracks all around my camp. The thing had circled me dozens of times during the night, always staying just out of sight, but now the tracks were changing, getting smaller, more human-shaped. It was learning to look like me, not just sound like me. And somewhere out there, 2 more people were still alive, waiting for rescue that might never come. I had less than 12 hours before Rick arrived. 12 hours to find Dr. Chen and Mike Peterson before the Wendigo finished learning how to be human. 12 hours before, it didn't need to hunt in the wilderness anymore. 12 hours before it could walk into town wearing my face and no one would know the difference. I found Dr. Chen and Mike Peterson in a place that shouldn't have existed. Following the creature's tracks had led me to what looked like a dead end, a cliff face rising straight up from the tundra, but when I looked closer, I found a crack in the rock, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The tracks led right into it. Inside was a cavern, the size of a cathedral, carved from black stone and lit by some kind of phosphorescent moss that gave everything a sickly green glow. The air was thick and humid, like being inside something's mouth, and it was full of bones, human bones, arranged in careful patterns across the floor. Skulls stacked in pyramids, arm and leg bones laid out in spirals, ribs hanging from the ceiling like wind chimes. Some of the bones were old, bleached white by time. Others still had meat on them. In the center of this charnel house, I found them. Dr. Chen and Mike Peterson were alive, but barely. The creature had wrapped them in some kind of cocoon made from strips of hide and sinew, hanging them from the ceiling like sides of beef in a meat locker. They were unconscious but breathing. I was cutting Dr. Chen down when I heard footsteps behind me. "Elena, what are you doing here?" I spun around, and my blood turned to ice. Standing in the entrance to the cavern was another me. Same face, same uniform, same everything. But when it spoke, the voice was too perfect. No one sounds that much like themselves. "You're not supposed to be here," the fake Elena said, stepping closer. "This is my place now." I raised my rifle, but the thing just smiled. When it did, I could see that it had too many teeth, all sharp as needles. "You can't kill me with that," it said, still using my voice. "I'm part of you now. I've learned everything about you, your memories, your fears, your hopes. I know you better than you know yourself." "You don't know anything," I shot back. "You're just an echo. A copy." The creature laughed, and the sound echoed off the bone-covered walls. "I know that you blame yourself for your grandfather's death. I know that you joined the military to prove you were tough enough for this life. I know that you've been alone for so long you've forgotten how to trust anyone." Each word hit like a physical blow. The thing was inside my head somehow, reading thoughts and memories I'd never shared with anyone. "I know that you came here to save people," it continued. "But you can't save anyone. You couldn't save your grandfather. You couldn't save these scientists. And you can't save yourself." That's when I understood what it was really doing. The Wendigo didn't just mimic voices and faces. It stole everything that made a person who they were. Their memories, their personality, their soul. It wasn't just learning to look like me, it was becoming me. But I'll keep the best parts, the creature said, reading my thoughts. Your survival skills, your knowledge of the wilderness, your ability to convince people to trust you. I'll use them to hunt more efficiently. I thought about all the missing persons cases over the years, hikers and hunters who'd vanished without a trace. How many of them had met things wearing familiar faces? How many had died thinking they were being rescued by someone they trusted? The hunger never stops, the fake Elena explained, circling me slowly. Every winter, it gets stronger. Every person I consume adds to what I am. Soon I'll have enough memories, enough identities, to walk among humans without being detected. You're insane if you think you can pass for human in the real world. Am I? I have your memories, Elena. I know about your job, your friends, your routine. I could walk into your life tomorrow and no one would know the difference. Except I'd be so much better at it than you are. The thing was right, and that terrified me more than anything else. It had been studying me for days, learning every detail of my life. It could probably fool Jim and the other rangers, at least for a while. Why are you telling me this? I asked, trying to buy time while I figured out how to fight something that was essentially me but stronger and faster. Because I want you to understand before you become part of me. Your grandfather understood at the end. He knew what was happening when the hunger took him. My blood went cold. What did you say? Oh, you didn't know? He didn't freeze to death in that storm, Elena. He starved. Starved so badly that The creature smiled with my face. Well, let's just say the hunger changes you, makes you willing to do things you never thought possible. I thought about my grandfather, found dead in his cabin after a late spring blizzard. The official report said exposure, but there had been questions. Things about the scene that didn't add up. He fought it for days, the Wendigo continued. But eventually, the hunger won. It always does. That's how I was born, Elena. From his hunger, his need to survive at any cost. The rifle felt heavy in my hands. You're lying. Am I? Think about it. How do you think I knew so much about your family? About your grandmother's stories? I am your grandfather's legacy, his gift to you. I wanted to pull the trigger, to blow the thing's head clean off. But it was wearing my face, speaking with my voice. Killing it would be like killing myself, and maybe that's what I needed to do. Elena, don't listen to it, Doctor. Chen's voice, weak but real. She'd regained consciousness and was struggling against her bindings. It's trying to get inside your head. The creature turned toward her, annoyed. Quiet. Your turn comes later. That moment of distraction was all I needed. I pulled the trigger. The rifle boomed in the confined space, the sound so loud it made my ears ring. The bullet caught the Wendigo center mass and knocked it backward into the bone wall, but it didn't go down. It looked down at the spreading bloodstain on its uniform, then back at me. Iron bullets, it said conversationally. Cute. But you can't kill hunger, Elena. You can't kill need. The wound was already closing, the thing's body repairing itself faster than should be possible. Your grandmother's stories never told you the real way to fight the Wendigo, did they? It asked, advancing on me again. They were incomplete, watered down for children. I backed away, working the bolt action to chamber another round. Then tell me. Fire, the creature said. Sacred fire, lit with the old words, and fed with the right offerings. But you don't know the old words, do you? You turned your back on all that traditional nonsense. It was right. I'd grown up hearing the stories, but I'd never learned the ceremonies. That was old-world superstition, and I was a modern woman with a college degree and military training. Doesn't matter anyway, the Wendigo continued. I won't give you the chance. It lunged at me, moving faster than anything human-sized should be able to move. I got off one more shot before it reached me, but the bullet passed right through its chest without slowing it down. The impact sent me flying backward into the wall of bones. Skulls rained down around me as I hit the ground hard. My rifle went skittering away across the cavern floor. The creature stood over me, still wearing my face but not bothering to hide its true nature anymore. Its fingers had become claws. and its mouth had stretched to accommodate rows of needle-sharp teeth. "This is how it ends," it said in my voice. "Not with a heroic last stand, but with you, becoming part of something greater than yourself." I closed my eyes and did something I hadn't done since I was a child. I prayed to my grandmother's spirits, to the old powers she'd believed in, to anything that might be listening. And somewhere in my memory, I heard her voice singing the old songs. The words came back to me like water flowing downhill, ancient Athabascan phrases that had been passed down through generations of my family. I opened my eyes and started to sing. The effect was immediate. The Wendigo jerked backward like I'd hit it with an electric shock. For the first time since I'd encountered it, the creature looked afraid. "No," it snarled. "Those words have no power. The old ways are dead." But I kept singing, and the words seemed to take on a life of their own. The phosphorescent moss on the cavern walls began to glow brighter, and I could feel heat building in my chest. Sacred fire. Not the kind you light with matches, but the kind that burns in the heart when you remember who you really are. The Wendigo lunged at me again, but this time I was ready. I grabbed a burning piece of wood from my camping gear and held it out like a weapon. Where it touched the creature, smoke rose from its false skin. "The hunger can be fought," I said, understanding flooding through me. "But not with bullets, with choice." I thought about my grandfather, alone in that cabin during the storm. Starving, desperate, faced with an impossible decision. And I finally understood that he hadn't chosen to become a monster. He'd chosen to feed the monster so his granddaughter might have a chance to stop it. The Wendigo screamed, a sound like winter wind through bare trees. It grabbed at me with its claws, but every time it touched the burning wood, parts of it crumbled away like ash. "This is what the hunger really fears," I shouted over its screams. "Not death, choice. The choice to starve rather than become something terrible." I pressed the burning wood against the creature's chest, and it began to collapse in on itself. The stolen faces and voices fell away like masks, revealing something ancient and terrible underneath, but also something pitifully small. At its core, the Wendigo was just hunger, just need and desperation given shape, and like any hungry thing, it could be starved. "I choose to let you go," I whispered. "I choose to forgive what you made my grandfather become. And I choose to remember that being human means sometimes going hungry rather than eating what shouldn't be eaten." The creature gave one last shriek and then crumbled into ash that scattered on a wind that seemed to come from nowhere. The cavern began to collapse around me. I cut down Dr. Chen and Mike Peterson, threw them over my shoulders, and ran for the entrance as tons of rock came crashing down behind us. We made it out just as the whole hillside caved in, burying the Wendigo's lair forever. Outside, I could hear the sound of helicopter rotors. Rick was early. The official report said that Dr. Webb, Dr. Walsh, and Dr. Martinez died of exposure after becoming separated from the main group during a sudden blizzard. Dr. Chen and Mike Peterson were found suffering from hypothermia and exhaustion after taking shelter in a natural cave formation. I didn't mention the Wendigo. No one would have believed me anyway. Rick flew us all back to headquarters, where Dr. Chen and Peterson spent 3 days in the hospital recovering from their ordeal. They never talked about what really happened in that cavern, and I didn't ask them to. Some experiences are too big for words. The case was closed within a week. The university suspended their geological survey project indefinitely, citing safety concerns about working in such remote areas during winter months. Life went back to normal, or as normal as it could be. But things had changed for me. I started paying more attention to the old stories my grandmother had told. Started learning the ceremonies and songs I dismissed as superstition. Called my aunt in Fairbanks and asked her to teach me the traditional ways, because I understood now that some knowledge isn't meant to be written down in books. Some wisdom only survives when it's passed from one generation to the next, carried in the hearts of people who understand that the world is stranger and more dangerous than most folks realize. I also started carrying different supplies in my pack. Not just the standard survival gear, but things my grandmother would have recognized. Sweet grass for burning, sacred tobacco, an old ceremonial knife that had been in our family for generations. Just in case. The nightmares started about a month later. Not every night, but often enough that I learned to sleep with the lights on. Dreams of hearing my own voice calling from dark places. Dreams of things wearing familiar faces but moving wrong. Dr. Chen called to me once, about 6 months after the incident. We didn't talk about what happened in the cavern, but she mentioned that she'd been having trouble sleeping too. "Do you think we really killed it?" she asked. I thought about that question for a long time before answering. I think we killed that one. But hunger is like a disease, Dr. Chen. It spreads, and there are a lot of hungry people in this world. She was quiet for a moment. So what do? We remember, we stay human, and we teach other people how to make the right choices when they're faced with impossible situations. After we hung up, I sat in my cabin, looking out at the wilderness that had been my home for 15 years. It looked the same as always, but I saw it differently now. Not just as empty land to be protected, but as a place where ancient things still lived and hunted, where people could face choices that would define not just their own survival, but their very souls. I kept working as a ranger for another 10 years. I helped search for missing hikers, rescued lost hunters, and investigated incidents that couldn't be explained by normal circumstances. Some of those incidents involved things that shouldn't exist but did anyway. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind was howling through the trees, I heard voices calling from the darkness. Different voices than before, but the same terrible hunger behind them. Each time, I remembered my grandmother's songs. Each time, I chose to stay human. Because that's what we do. We remember the stories that matter. We pass on the warnings that might save lives. And when we're faced with the choice between surviving and staying human, we choose humanity. Even when it's the harder choice. Even when we're hungry. The wilderness is still out there, vast and beautiful and deadly, full of wonders and terrors that most people will never see. And somewhere in that wilderness, hunger prowls on 2 legs, wearing stolen faces and speaking with borrowed voices. But it can be fought, not with guns or science or modern technology, with choice, with memory, with the knowledge that some things are worth starving for. My grandmother knew that. My grandfather learned it too late. And now you know it too. Remember that, next time you're alone in the dark and you hear a familiar voice calling for help, remember to choose carefully. Remember to stay human. Even when everything inside you is screaming to do whatever it takes to survive, that's when being human matters most of all.